For almost 2 decades following the death of WCW, there was only one major league out there in the United States if you wanted to enjoy a large-scale wrestling product. And for a while, it looked like that was going to be the case forever. But then something happened. In 2019, an all-new promotion was born. But how did the inaugural year of this new company pan out? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now in AEW in 2019, a year in review. Of course, if we really want to go back to the start, then we have to head over to 2017 and 2018. Those were the years where 4 key events happened, the first of which occurred on May 16th of the former year when the Twitter account @TheWWEGuy famously tweeted Dave Meltzer asking him if there was any chance of a non-WWE promotion ever putting 10,000 people in an arena in North America again. And given where things were at the time, Meltzer's reply would be that this wasn't likely to happen anytime soon. That said, Cody Rhodes, then member of the Bullet Club, disagreed with this opinion strongly, which was why he'd reply to Dave here with a tweet of his own, which effectively said, "Challenge accepted." Not that Cody would meet this challenge quite yet, though. No, what he and his Bullet Club stablemates, the Young Bucks, had planned would take a while to come to fruition. While this was being formulated, however, the second key event in the birth of AEW would take place when, at Wrestle Kingdom on January 4th of 2018, New Japan Pro Wrestling's version of WrestleMania, Chris Jericho would jump over to the land of the rising sun, and, in the Battle of Winnipeg, would have a dream match against Kenny Omega, which served as the semi-main event of the show. And such a big deal would this prove to be with Western audiences, it boosted sales of New Japan World and JPW's streaming service tenfold over in America, with this being the first real sign that there was a strong market out there for an audience desperate for an alternative to what was happening in WWE. Even then though, this would not be enough to get the wheels in motion yet. No, there would still be a couple of steps left, the next of which happened when, after months of planning, it would be on September 1st of 2018 that Cody Rhodes and the Young Bucks put on the biggest independent show in wrestling history, All In, a show which ended up selling over 11,000 tickets. How did it manage to do so well? Well, a large part of the reason for that was because of the cult following the Bucks and Kenny Omega had built up online with their Being the Elite web series, a series which had at one point seen their t-shirts become a huge seller in Hot Topic stores. So given how successful this show was then, it only solidified what had already been shown by the success of that Kenny Omega-Chris Jericho match earlier on in the year, that there was a large enough fan base out there who were willing to tune in to a Major League American Wrestling product which wasn't WWE. But this still wouldn't have been enough to get things going without one more very important factor, someone who had the money to fund such an operation. Luckily then, this person would exist in the form of Tony Khan, billionaire owner of both the Jacksonville Jaguars and Fulham Football Club, and more importantly, a lifelong wrestling fan. Khan, as it happened, had actually been present at All In, with it being him who provided his private jet to get Chris Jericho to the show for a surprise appearance. And once he saw what was going on there, he realized an opportunity had presented itself. You see, for all of his life, Tony Khan had dreamed of running a wrestling promotion of his own, and now that there was potential money to be made in such an idea, he was able to take it to his father Shahid Khan, who ultimately helped him to get things off the ground. And after that, Khan was able to start a conversation with a Warner Brothers executive, Kevin Riley, at a party both men had attended, where he convinced him that, almost 2 decades after WCW had stopped airing on the network, there were now a lot of benefits in bringing wrestling back to TNT. So it was then that as rumors began swirling around the wrestling world about this new venture, it would be on January 1st, 2019 that things were confirmed when a press conference was held in Jacksonville to announce the formation of All Elite Wrestling. And this wouldn't be just another indie promotion. No, it would be large scale, with a lot of money behind it and a weekly 2-hour primetime show on TNT called Dynamite. That said, just having the TV time and the money wouldn't have meant so much if the roster wasn't there. But thankfully for Tony Khan, this was the perfect time to start something like this because Kenny Omega, the Young Bucks, Chris Jericho, and the man destined to be the main character of the company, Hangman Adam Page, would all be free agents at the same time and would all be present there to tell the world that they were going to be day one members of AEW. Really then, it was just a case of waiting for things to get started now, something which would take another few months as infrastructure had to be put in place and venues had to be booked for events. So that meant there was a few months which followed on from here spent waiting around as the initial roster was filled out with performers such as MJF, Pac, SoCal Uncensored, Darby Allin, the Lucha Brothers, Jack Perry, Sammy Guevara, Britt Baker, and more. Eventually, though, we would get to the inaugural AEW show, Double or Nothing, on May 25th. And it was here that things kicked off with a major bang, as Tony Khan and the Elite set out their mission statement of creating an alternative with a show which would feature a far more sports-centric presentation, a ranking system which ensured that wins and losses mattered. As you would expect then, Double or Nothing was an almost unanimously very well received show, one which immediately made AEW feel like a big league promotion, as the card would feature bouts such as the Young Bucks and the Lucha Brothers battling it out over the AAA World Tag Team titles, Britt Baker besting Awesome Kong, Kylie Rae, and Nyla Rose in a women's four-way, Hangman Page winning the inaugural Casino Battle Royal after last eliminating MJF, and in one of the best bouts of early All Elite Wrestling, Cody Rhodes and Dustin Rhodes having a hugely emotional and bloody showdown. That said, none of these matches were the main event. No, that spot was saved for the rematch from Wrestle Kingdom 12, the bout which has served as one of the early sparks for the promotion, Chris Jericho versus Kenny Omega 2. Who would win this one? Well, that would be Jericho, but he wouldn't be standing tall once the night was over because, in yet another example of momentum being on AEW's side here, after the main event ended, Jon Moxley would arrive to lay out both men and announce that he too was All Elite. Yes, a guy who had been WWE champion only a few years before, and who had been a major main event player over in WWE as recently as a few months prior, had jumped ship to the competition. And this meant that, as the year progressed, Tony Khan would have a major weapon in his arsenal to be used in the war to come. What was this war? Well, it would be the Wednesday Night Wars, a name given to the weekly battles between Dynamite and NXT as, once it was announced that the former would be airing every Wednesday on TNT starting in October, the WWE developmental brand moved to that date too in order to oppose them. Before we'd get there, though, there would be a couple more AEW shows to come in order to keep things moving during the intervening time, with these being free pay-per-view level shows which aired online, the first of which was Fyter Fest on June 19th. As to what would happen at this event, well, after online shows like Being the Elite were used to build up the card in lieu of Dynamite being on the air yet, things would kick off with a Dragon Gate star, Seema, beating Christopher Daniels, all before Riho then scored a win of her own during a three-way against Nyla Rose and Yuka Sakazaki. Then, once that was over, 3 of the 4 pillars of the early days of AEW would get their first non-battle royal match in the promotion when MJF, Jungle Boy, and Jimmy Havoc were defeated by Hangman Adam Page. Then, Darby Allin proceeded to go to a 20-minute time limit draw with Cody Rhodes. That said, neither of these would be the main event of the show either. No, there would really be 2 main events here, the official one of which saw the Elite beat the Lucha Brothers and Laredo Kid in a trios bout which ultimately set up a rematch at AAA's Triple Mania 27 a couple of months later. And then there was the unofficial one not to be recognized in the rankings, which saw Jon Moxley get the better of Joey Janela in a lights out contest. Yes, it was here that in waging a one-man war against AEW, Jon Moxley had his sights set on taking over the whole company the only way he knew how, by increasingly wild levels of violence. And despite him being a heel at that point, like with Steve Austin in 1996, he just looked so cool that it was hard for fans to boo him. Of course, for as over as he was here, Mox would not be in the running to become the inaugural AEW Men's World Champion. No, that match had already been decided before he showed up at the end of Double or Nothing because, after having won the Casino Battle Royal at the start of the show, Adam Page had made himself one of the top contenders, and upon beating Kenny Omega in the main event, Chris Jericho made himself the other. Before we'd find out which of these two would win their eventual showdown, however, and in the process become the first person to hold the top prize in Jacksonville, there would be one more free pay-per-view level show aired, with that being Fight for the Fallen on July 13th. What happened at this show? Well, in what was promoted as a charity event to help the victims of gun violence, things would get kicked off with MJF, Sammy Guevara, and Shawn Spears getting the better of Darby Allin, Jimmy Havoc, and Joey Janela in a trios match. And once that was over, Brandi Rhodes would highlight a lot of the weaknesses of the early women's division in All Elite Wrestling during her snoozer against Allie. That's right. While pretty much every aspect of AEW was being praised in 2019 as the company had a lot of goodwill and positive momentum, the women's division was almost universally criticized for being the weakest part of the show by far, with it feeling like there was very little effort being put into it. Still, even if that was the case, the rest of the show would impress during the undercard bouts, such as Hangman Page's defeat of Kip Sabian, the Lucha Bros toppling of SoCal Uncensored, and Kenny Omega coming out the victor in his singles competition against CIMA. And then of course there was the main event of the evening, a first time ever tag team match pitting two sets of brothers against one another as the Young Bucks took on the duo of Cody and Dustin Rhodes. Who won this one? Well, that would be the Bucks. And this meant they'd move on to the upcoming tournament to crown the inaugural AEW Men's Tag Team Champions, all while the Rhodes brothers returned to singles action. That's right, aside from there being a mini-tournament to decide who the first ever AEW Men's World Champion would be, there were also tournaments either in progress or about to begin to see who would win the AEW Men's Tag Team and Women's World Championships. And as All Out came around on August 31st and, in the process, gave us All Elite Wrestling's second true pay-per-view, both those tournaments would continue. Yes, as another 10,000 rabid fans filled out the Sears Center Arena here for an event which, based on the many tens of thousands who were waiting in the Ticketmaster queue on the day tickets went on sale, could have probably filled out a large stadium, they got to watch on as Riho defeated Hikaru Shida in a singles showdown, all while Nyla Rose last eliminated Britt Baker during a women's casino battle royal to ensure that these would be the top two contenders fighting it out to call themselves Women's World Champion on the debut episode of Dynamite. Elsewhere, meanwhile, the Dark Order would be besting the Best Friends in order to earn a bye in the first round of the men's tag team title tournament, with this ultimately serving as a setup for the debut of Orange Cassidy. And these wouldn't be the only notable moments during the undercard of the show. No, aside from that, Jimmy Havoc would defeat both Darby Allin and Joey Janela in a three-way bout, Cody Rhodes would make relatively short work of his old friend Shawn Spears, the Lucha Bros and Young Bucks would meet once more in an Escalera de la Muerta match for the AAA World Tag Team titles, and after Jon Moxley had to be pulled from the event at the last minute as the result of an injury, Pac would sub in for him to score an upset win over Kenny Omega. What could possibly follow all of that? Well, there could only be one option, really, the first one-on-one showdown between Chris Jericho and Hangman Adam Page to see who the first ever AEW Men's World Champion would be. And after a hard-fought battle which went on for almost 30 minutes, it would be Y2J who came out on top here. Yes, Chris Jericho was now the top dog in All Elite Wrestling, with this being a move made so as to help get even more attention on the promotion during its early days. That said, there would be a small bump in the road here, as in one of the funniest stories in wrestling history, almost immediately after winning the title, Jericho would lose it when someone stole it from his limo while he was eating a celebratory dinner at Longhorn Steakhouse. Of course, Le Champion was able to play into this with some online videos calling for a worldwide investigation into the grand larceny which had taken place here, turning the whole thing into a joke in the process. And as the days went on, the belt would be recovered when it was found on the side of the road by Tallahassee police, suggesting the person who'd taken it had gotten scared off by the growing heat surrounding the situation. So all this meant that when Dynamite finally debuted on October 2nd, the men's world title would be around the waist of the champ once more, as he began a feud with the Elite by forming a stable of his own around himself, one which included Sammy Guevara, Proud and Powerful, and Jake Hager, which would be known as the Inner Circle. Basically, during the early days of Dynamite, this would be the feud the company was built around, so much so that it was originally meant to be blown off during the now lost original Blood and Guts match in the spring of the following year. But it wouldn't be the only thing making Wednesday nights worth tuning into TNT for. No, as AEW went to war with NXT and quickly pulled ahead of them in terms of TV ratings, other highlights of the show would include Riho becoming the inaugural AEW Women's World Champion on the debut edition of Dynamite 2 when she beat Nyla Rose for the honor. Hangman Page beginning his long-term journey through his fall, redemption, and eventual men's world title win, performers like MJF, Jack Perry, and Britt Baker getting some early shine, and Chris Jericho attempting to elevate some new talent in TV world title programs against Darby Allin and Scorpio Sky. Hell, if 2 hours of Dynamite every week wasn't enough for fans, there was also AEW Dark, a YouTube exclusive which aired every Tuesday and which showed untelevised matches filmed before Dynamite aired. Basically, what we're saying here is that there was plenty of content out there for someone who was into what Tony Khan and the Elite were doing back in 2019. and based on the general feeling from the wrestling community, there was a large percentage of fans who were into the product here, as in many ways it felt like a breath of fresh air in comparison to where the competition was at the time. Come on now, we haven't even gotten to the men's tag team title tournament yet, a tournament which took place entirely on those early episodes of Dynamite and saw such highlights as Private Party upsetting the Young Bucks in the first round. In the end though, it would not be Private Party who won the whole thing. Rather, after beating the Lucha Bros in the finals, SoCal Uncensored, specifically Scorpio Sky and Frankie Kazarian, would be the ones to call themselves inaugural tag team champions. So that meant they'd be in possession of the gold by the time Full Gear came around on November 9th, the final pay-per-view of the year for All Elite Wrestling, and there, they'd be defending against both the Lucha Bros and Private Party in a three-way tag match, a match they ultimately won. Elsewhere, meanwhile, Proud and Powerful would score a win for the Inner Circle when they beat the Young Bucks, Hangman Page would earn a victory against Pac, and Riho would successfully defend her Women's World title against Emi Sakura. As for the main event, well, like with Fyter Fest, there would technically be two of them, an official one and an unofficial one. And the reason for that was because one would be so violent, Tony Khan would have no choice but to kayfabe refuse to sanction it, meaning it would be another lights out match. That's right, in one of the earlier examples of AEW turning the brutality up to levels you were simply never going to see in other North American promotions, Jon Moxley and Kenny Omega finally went one-on-one. And by the time it was all said and done, it would be Mox who had managed to come out on top. As to the other main event, the official one, well, that would be very different, as rather than be all about the blood and the guts, this would be about the men's world title. Yes, it was here that Cody Rhodes challenged Chris Jericho for the gold, with the added stipulation being that if the American Nightmare didn't win the big one this time around, he'd never be able to challenge for it again. And in the end, that would be what happened because after his cornerman MJF threw in the towel while Cody was locked in the Lion Tamer, the match would be awarded to Le Champion. And that wasn't the end of Rhodes' woes either, because once the bout was over, MJF would solidify his heel turn by delivering a low blow to his mentor, with this instantly making him the biggest heel in the promotion and the man who was clearly the heir apparent to the top spot. Really, with the possible exception of Hangman Page, it was Maxwell Jacob Friedman who felt like Tony Khan's secret weapon at this stage in the game. He was certainly helping them overtake NXT, as by now the Wednesday Night Wars were already becoming something of a one-horse race. And after he gained a new minion in Wardlow, he was able to further his rise by winning the Dynamite Diamond Ring for the first of 5 times during the November 27th episode of Dynamite. What else was happening during the final few Dynamites of the year? Well, as Cody Rhodes attempted to goad MJF into giving him a one-on-one match, Kenny Omega would bounce back from his loss to Jon Moxley by starting an excellent TV feud with Pac. And as for Mox, well, he'd set his sights on becoming the #1 contender to Chris Jericho's men's world title. But not all would be well down in Jacksonville here because, while 90% of what they were doing was very well received, there were still a few niggling complaints the fans had, the main one of which was still the weak booking of the women's division. And then of course, there was the Elite. You see, in an attempt to get others over, the Elite had done a lot of losing during those early days of AEW, and as the year drew to a close, there were some people who were starting to get frustrated by this as they felt it was actually becoming a negative to the entire promotion that the top babyface group kept jobbing themselves out. And it was this, combined with a pretty infamous Dark Order angle on the December 18th edition of Dynamite, in which the Geek Heels destroyed the Elite to close out the show, which saw more people start to tune in to NXT. Hell, so many people would there be who changed the channel here, this would be the night that NXT beat AEW in the ratings. So obviously then, while 2019 had represented a very strong start for the Jacksonville-based promotion, as the year was ending, they found themselves at a turning point all of a sudden. How would they be able to deal with this? Well, that wouldn't be a story for this video, because as a result of them taking the Christmas week off, the December 18th episode of television would mark the end of the road for All Elite Wrestling as far as the 2010s were concerned. And what a run it had been so far. Sure, that ending was a little rough, but pretty much everything which had come before that had been exactly what fans had been hoping AEW would be when rumors of its existence first started percolating in late 2018. But the future was not all rosy because the promotion, and the world as a whole, was about to hit unforeseen challenges in 2020. Why was that? Well, this was the year we all went into lockdown, and so, as a result, no fans were allowed in attendance at shows for the foreseeable future. 2020 was a dark time for the world, and wrestling certainly wasn't immune to the kinds of struggles the rest of us were going through. What a terrible time it was then for an upstart promotion to be trying to establish themselves in the face of a very powerful competitor. But while All Elite Wrestling certainly couldn't have been happy to find themselves in these circumstances so early in their history, there was nothing they could do but power on. How well would they manage with this? Well, let's find out as we take a deep dive into the whole story from start to finish in AEW in 2020, a year in review. When we last left off, Chris Jericho was the AEW Men's World Champion, Riho was the Women's World Champion, and SoCal Uncensored were in possession of the tag team gold. Elsewhere, meanwhile, Cody Rhodes was seeking revenge over MJF after a bitter betrayal had frozen the American Nightmare out of the world title scene for good down in Jacksonville. And that was only the beginning of the Elite's woes because after Cody, Kenny Omega, the Young Bucks, and Hangman Adam Page had spent a good part of the first few months of the company's existence losing in order to get others over, fans were starting to tire of seeing the heroes staring up at the lights all the time. Hell, this had even gotten to a point where, during the last head-to-head week of the Wednesday Night Wars in 2019, NXT had beaten Dynamite in the ratings for the first time ever. So, realizing something had to be done to get things on track again, it would be over the Christmas period that Tony Khan decided to step in and take control going forward. Yes, from here on in, rather than the Elite having booking power, it would now be a case where, while they and others on the roster still had input in what was going on, the buck would ultimately stop with the boss, with it being Khan who now had the final say on everything that appeared on screen. And thankfully this worked out well because on the first Dynamite of the year, a show entitled Dynamite Homecoming on account of it seeing AEW return to the same Daily's place where the original press conference announcing the formation of the company had occurred, a new mission statement would be set out when the Elite came out victorious in all of their matches. Well, except for Hangman Adam Page, of course, as he was now entering a character arc where he was hitting the bottle a little too much on account of his loss at the hands of Chris Jericho. But even if the Hangman was struggling here, this renewed direction for Dynamite would be a hit with fans. So much of a hit would it be, in fact, once the ratings came out the next day, AEW would once more defeat NXT and would from there on in never lose again over the course of the entire Wednesday Night Wars. That's right, the momentum was back in Tony Khan's favor again. And this momentum continued over to the next Dynamite specials, which aired across January 15th and January 21st, entitled Bash at the Beach and Chris Jericho's Rockin' Rager at Sea, respectively. What happened here which was so notable? Well, aside from Jon Moxley beating Pac to establish himself as the next contender to Le Champion's men's world title, we'd also get Britt Baker finding herself after turning heel, and MJF continuing his rise with a victory over Joey Janela. Perhaps most importantly though, it was at the second show, the one filmed from the Jericho Cruise, that for the first time in AEW, a title changed hands. More specifically, the men's tag team titles. Yes, after coming together for long enough to earn themselves the #1 contendership spot, it would be on January 21st that Kenny Omega and Hangman Page were able to best SoCal Uncensored to start their own reign on top. And this meant that as the Revolution came around on February 29th, just 2 weeks after Riho had dropped her women's world title to Nyla Rose, they'd be putting their gold on the line. But this was no ordinary defense. No, when Omega and Page entered the ring that night to face off against their stablemates the Young Bucks, what followed was probably the best match in AEW to date, and one of the better tag team bouts ever seen on North American soil. In the end though, despite teases of Hangman turning heel on his partner continuing to be dropped, it would be the champs who retained here by the time all was said and done. And they weren't the only ones holding on to their gold, as elsewhere on the card, Nyla Rose would get the better of Chris Statlander during their showdown for the women's world title. What was happening on Revolution aside from this which made the show the most critically acclaimed one from AEW yet? Well, after 2 of the 4 pillars of the early days of the promotion met one-on-one when Darby Allin took on Sammy Guevara, Cody Rhodes would finally get his match with MJF. In something of a shocker, however, it would be Max who won this one, with a win of this scale seemingly putting him next in line for a shot at the men's world title. And after that was over, Orange Cassidy would show out when, in one of the highlights of the evening, he proved he was more than just a meme by absolutely tearing the house down against Pac. But none of these bouts were the main event of the show. No, the main event would be saved for the battle over the AEW Men's World title between incoming champion Chris Jericho and #1 contender Jon Moxley. Who would win this one? Well, despite Y2J having the full power of the inner circle behind him, in the end, that couldn't stop the now babyface Mox from climbing the mountaintop and becoming the second ever men's world champion in All Elite Wrestling's history. That's right, a new age had dawned in the company as for the first time, they had a babyface champ leading the charge. Unfortunately, though, it would be mere weeks after Revolution that things took an unforeseen turn when the world went into lockdown. Obviously then, because of that, no fans would be allowed in attendance at shows for the foreseeable future. And while Tony Khan worked out a testing system which would let performers attend TV safely, he'd advise anyone who wanted to stay home in the meantime that they could. So for the next 6 weeks or so then, Dynamite would operate under something of a skeleton crew from an undisclosed location in Atlanta, as rather than getting the original Blood and Guts match, which was supposed to take place on March 25th and would have served as the climax to the Elite Inner Circle feud, the main narrative thread running throughout Wednesday nights was the tournament to crown the inaugural TNT champion, AEW's first foray into a mid-card title. Not that this was the only thing happening on Dynamite during these darkest times, of course. No, there were also the debuts of both Broken Matt Hardy and Brody Lee, the latter of whom had been revealed as the secret leader of the Dark Order the week after lockdown started. And as it happened, with MJF being missing for most of the build to Double or Nothing, by the time that show happened on May 23rd from the open-air amphitheater that is Daly's Place, it would be the Exalted One himself who would be challenging Jon Moxley for the AEW Men's World title. That said, Brody would not be able to best the champ here. No, after their semi-main event was over that evening, Mox would still have the gold around his waist as he proved himself to be a fighting champion. But he'd be the only person successfully defending a belt here because when Nyla Rose attempted to get the better of her opponent at Double or Nothing, Hikaru Shida, it would be the Samokawa native who managed to get the Duke. Elsewhere, meanwhile, after Brian Cage debuted and won a casino ladder match in order to earn a future Men's World title shot, MJF would continue his upward momentum with a win over another pillar in the form of Jungle Boy. Of course, all of this paled in comparison when it came to the importance the next match was given, the finals of the tournament to crown the inaugural TNT champion. Who would be facing off against each other here? Well, that would be Cody Rhodes and Lance Archer. And in the end, despite the Murder Hawk monster putting on a valiant effort, it would be the American Nightmare who won the belt here, albeit a still unfinished version because, as a result of lockdown, getting the title complete in time for the show simply became impossible after a certain point. But that didn't matter too much to Rhodes. No, if he could no longer win the world title, then this represented the next best thing. And over the weeks which followed, he'd make an effort to establish his new prize by holding his weekly open challenges against anyone who wanted to take him on, be that an AEW employee like Scorpio Sky, or an at-the-time outsider like Eddie Kingston or Ricky Starks. What would this mean for Cody's status within the Elite? Well, it would seemingly be the end of it because, as rumors began to circulate about Rhodes no longer getting on with the rest of the stable behind the scenes, Kenny Omega, Hangman Page, and the Young Bucks would be forced to enlist others to help them in their cause whenever necessary, with the most notable example of this being in the main event of Double or Nothing when the foursome partnered up with Broken Matt Hardy to take on and defeat the Inner Circle in Stadium Stampede. That's right, in AEW's first foray into cinematic wrestling, they were able to put on one of the better examples of the genre, as both factions closed out Double or Nothing by doing battle all over Everbank Stadium, the home of the Jacksonville Jaguars, with some of the highlights being Hangman Page riding a horse out to the gridiron, Matt Hardy reincarnating himself in the luxury pool, and Kenny Omega hunting down Sammy Guevara in a golf buggy. And by the time all the madness was over then and the dust had settled, it would be the Elite who'd come out on top as the first big feud of AEW's history finally drew to a close. So, where would things go from there? Well, in the weeks which followed, as Cody Rhodes was continuing with his weekly TNT title open challenge, and a now injured Britt Baker was maintaining her presence on TV with some fun segments, Jon Moxley would be preparing to face the challenge of Brian Cage, with this being a challenge which finally arrived at the Dynamite special entitled Fyter Fest, airing across July 1st and July 8th. Or at least that was the plan. In the end, though, after Mox had to be pulled from these shows at the last minute, this bout would be held off for an extra week, as instead Brian Cage and his manager Taz came out to the ring on the second night of the event in order to announce a new title being added to AEW. What was this title? Well, it would be an unsanctioned one, a belt ECW fans were very familiar with, the FTW title. Yes, after having retired this piece of hardware way back in 1999, Taz brought it out of the mothballs here in order to give it to his client, the man who he felt was the true uncrowned champion of AEW. As to what else was happening on Fyter Fest, well, aside from Hikaru Shida having her first successful women's world title defense against Penelope Ford, Kenny Omega and Hangman Page would continue to coexist as they beat their challenger for the men's tag team titles, the Best Friends, on night one. And as if that weren't enough, on night 2 of Fyter Fest, they'd rack up another defense, this time against Private Party. Sure, there were still clearly some issues between them as the tensions with Hangman and the rest of the Elite threatened to fracture things beyond repair. But for the time being, the title reign would continue. And that was a good thing for the Young Bucks because by then, they had already had their hands full dealing with a new threat. Why was that? Well, only a week prior, FTR had made the jump from WWE and had set their sights on proving they were the best tag team in the world, something they hoped to do by beating the Bucks in a dream match. Not that this match would happen here, however. No, fans would have to wait for a while for it yet. What we got instead in the main event of Night 2 of Fyter Fest was the one-on-one showdown between Chris Jericho and his newest rival, Orange Cassidy, a match which served as a fitting end to the first wrestling show to have fans in attendance since the lockdown began. Yes, as a result of Daly's Place being an open-air amphitheater, Tony Khan was able to have a limited number of people watching the show from the stands here, so long as they were all socially distanced from one another, of course. And like that then, a little bit of normality was able to return to the world as from there on in, Dynamite would feature small pockets of fans each and every week. But for as exciting as this all was, there was still one big match missing from Fyter Fest, which that particular audience didn't get to see, the aforementioned men's world title bout pitting Jon Moxley against Brian Cage. No, that wouldn't come until 1 week later when Fight for the Fallen, another TV special which this time served as a charity fundraiser for victims of the pandemic, took place on July 15th. And it wasn't just Moxley versus Cage which happened here. No, the event would also feature Cody Rhodes defending his TNT title against Sonny Kiss, FTR scoring a big win over the Lucha Bros, the Elite combo of Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks besting the Jurassic Express in a 6-man tag, all while an increasingly distant Hangman Page kept away, and in possibly the nadir of the women's division, Brandi Rhodes and her Nightmare Collective stunk out the joint in a quick squash match. Seriously, while pretty much everything about AEW was clicking here, the women's division was still a gaping black hole of quality on the show as, partially on account of all the top talent being signed by WWE and partially because of Tony Khan not seeming to value the division all that much at this point, things just continued to go from bad to worse. Even the work of people like Chris Statlander, Britt Baker, and the woman still in possession of the women's world title, Hikaru Shida, could do little to change that. Needless to say then, this meant that when it came to world title bouts, it was largely up to the men to keep the quality strong. And that quality would remain high as Mox ultimately defeated Brian Cage by submission in the closing match of Fight for the Fallen. Where would things go next for All Elite Wrestling? Well, things would remain strong because over the weeks which followed, TV would continue to thrive, perhaps most notably when Cody Rhodes' TNT title run came to an end after he was absolutely squashed by Brody Lee on August 22nd. And then of course there was the moment not long after that when Hangman Page was formally kicked out of the Elite by the Young Bucks after FTR got in his head and convinced him to screw his friends during a #1 contendership gauntlet match for the men's tag team titles. A move which they claimed would stop the Cowboy from having to face his friends in the ring again, but which was actually designed to let the gauntlet be won by Dax and Cash instead. Obviously then, this all set up a showdown between FTR and the reigning champions at All Out on September 5th, with Kenny Omega continuing to partner with Page here, more out of respect for the belts they held than any kind of friendship anymore. But that partnership wouldn't make it to the end of the evening, because it was during this bout that FTR bested the champs to take home the gold for their own for the first time. Elsewhere, meanwhile, after Britt Baker somewhat returned to the ring for a cinematic tooth and nail match against Big Swole, Lance Archer would win a casino battle royal to earn himself a future men's world title shot. And once that was over, after taking a scary bump mid-match, Matt Hardy would be allowed to continue under controversial circumstances in order to defeat Sammy Guevara in a broken rules bout. But this was only the beginning as far as All Out was concerned, because once those matches were over, there would still be the rubber match to come between Orange Cassidy and Chris Jericho. That's right, after OC had won round 2 on an episode of Dynamite a few weeks prior, he'd take things to 2-1 here during a Mimosa Mayhem match, a bout in which things could be won by dumping your opponent in a vat of orange juice and bubbly. And then, of course, there were the 2 world title contests, the first of which saw Hikaru Shida defend against then NWA contracted performer Thunder Rosa, and the second of which saw MJF finally get his shot at Jon Moxley. Unfortunately for Max, though, he would not come out on top here. No, despite his best efforts, the reign of the Ace would continue as the winter approached. That said, he would still have plenty of challengers coming for his crown because on the September 23rd episode of Dynamite, he'd have an impromptu defense against his old friend Eddie Kingston after Lance Archer had to be pulled from the show at the last minute. And this wasn't the only big match happening on Wednesday nights around this time, as just 2 weeks after that, Brody Lee would go out with a bang in what turned out to be his last bout prior to his untimely passing when he lost the TNT title back to Cody Rhodes in a brutal dog collar match. Still not convinced Dynamite was on a roll here? Well, how about the fact that on the anniversary episode of Dynamite on October 14th, Mox would finally defend against Lance Archer, something he was able to do successfully, and this would leave a question as to who was going to be the #1 contender for Full Gear on October 7th. But while some people might have expected a new opponent for this show, in the end it would be a rematch which took place, because so well received was the initial Mox-Kingston bout. Given the two men's long history together on the indies, it was decided to run it back for the pay-per-view, now with the added gimmick of the whole thing being an I Quit match. As you would expect then, what followed was a very strong match, one ultimately won by Moxley after he forced Eddie to give up while he was being choked out with a steel chain. And that was far from the only notable thing that happened on the show, as, in the undercard, Hikaru Shida would successfully defend her AEW Women's World title against Nyla Rose, Matt Hardy would get the better of Sammy Guevara in a cinematic Elite Deletion bout, and after their Le Dinner Debonair musical segment made the Best of 2020 list for the New York Times of all places, MJF and Chris Jericho went one-on-one, with Max's victory here meaning that going forward, both he and Wardlow would be allowed to join the Inner Circle. But even this was only scratching the surface of the notable moments on Full Gear, because aside from all that, there would also be Darby Allin climbing the next rung on the ladder when he beat Cody Rhodes for the TNT title, and the Young Bucks finally squaring off against FTR in the Dream match, which ultimately saw Nick and Matt Jackson become the new men's tag team champions. Then, of course, there was the finals of a tournament to decide the #1 contender to the AEW Men's World title. After going their separate ways following the loss of their tag team titles, this one would see Kenny Omega and Hangman Page meet one-on-one for the first time, and, continuing the story of the fall coming before the rise, Hangman lose to his former partner, as the Best Bout Machine from there set his sights on Jon Moxley. When would that match come? Well, that would be Winter is Coming, another Dynamite special held on December 2nd, and it wasn't just the Men's World title which was on the line here. No, aside from that, there was also MJF winning the Dynamite Diamond Ring for a second year in a row, Britt Baker returning to in-ring action in full with a victory over Layla Hirsch, and after Darby Allin and Cody Rhodes were able to get the better of the Team Taz duo of Ricky Starks and Powerhouse Hobbs, we'd see the AEW debut of Sting. Yes, Steve Borden had arrived in Jacksonville, and as we would soon learn, the reason he was here was to act as a mentor to Darby Allin. But that wasn't even the biggest story coming out of this show. No, the biggest story was that after TNA's Don Callis got involved in the main event to help his legitimate protege Kenny Omega, the Cleaner would be able to beat Jon Moxley to become the third ever AEW Men's World Champion. What would happen after that? Well, now that Kenny had turned heel and joined forces with the man shoot responsible for putting together that famous Omega-Jericho showdown at Wrestle Kingdom 12, the one which served as an early inspiration point for AEW, he'd take the belt with him to the next episode of TNA Impact. Yes, well, it wasn't the true forbidden door of New Japan Pro Wrestling being opened quite yet. As 2021 approached, AEW and TNA were now going to have a full-blown working relationship. But while that would have been a hell of a way for 2020 to end for All Elite Wrestling, there was still one more big moment to come, and unfortunately, this would be a tragedy. What happened? Well, on December 26th, to the surprise of everyone, Brody Lee would pass away suddenly as a result of the incredibly rare condition idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, so because of that, creative plans for the final Dynamite of the year on December 30th would be scrapped, as instead the whole thing was rewritten to be a tribute to the fallen leader of the Dark Order. And what followed was probably two of the most emotional hours of television you're ever likely to see, as in what basically served as a televised wake, the Brody Lee celebration of life would see members of the Dark Order team with babyfaces like the Young Bucks, Hangman Adam Page, Orange Cassidy, and Cody Rhodes in what ended up being a clean sweep of victories. Hell, so emotional would this show be, even then contracted WWE performers like Bryan Danielson would tweet out asking people to watch it. And that made the whole situation sting a little bit less, as, right during the middle of a wrestling war, it was able to bring both sides together for the briefest of moments. And as 2020 was closing out, fans were eagerly anticipating what was going to happen next with things like the TNA partnership, Sting and AEW, and the continuing saga of Adam Page. Would Kenny Omega keep hold of the belt for long? Would the Stinger take Darby Allin to the next level? Would the Cowboy finally turn things around? Those questions and more will be answered when we move on to 2021. 2021 was the year in which the world returned to some sense of normality. And for wrestling, this meant fans finally coming back to arenas. Obviously then, this was a good thing for AEW as it helped them to continue with the wave of momentum they were on, a wave which was about to, in many ways, reach its highest crest. Yes, it's widely regarded as the company's peak. So let's take a deep dive into the entire year from start to finish right now in AEW in 2021, a year in review. When we last left off, MJF had just wormed his way into the inner circle, Hikaru Shida was in the midst of a lengthy reign as AEW Women's World Champion, and when it came to the men's version of the belt, Kenny Omega had just beaten Jon Moxley for this, in the process aligning himself with Don Callis and formally opening up a working relationship between All Elite Wrestling and TNA. And this meant that as the weeks went on, not only would the Cleaner begin appearing on Impact semi-regularly, he'd also eventually win their world title. What did this mean for the Elite back over in AEW? Well, given Kenny had also had possession of the AAA Mega Championship by then, it allowed him to lead the faction as the Belt Collector, the man dripping in gold. And this would be a moniker he'd proudly show off, as at the Dynamite special entitled New Year's Smash, which aired across January 6th and January 13th, he'd successfully defend his AEW Men's World title in a banger against Rey Fenix. But this was far from the only thing of note happening at New Year's Smash, as elsewhere on the card, Cody Rhodes would bring Snoop Dogg down to the ring with him as he defeated Matt Sydal, and Hikaru Shida would successfully defend her Women's World title against Abaddon. Then, once that was over, newcomer to AEW Miro would submit Chuck Taylor, and Darby Allin would retain his TNT championship in a hard-fought war with Brian Cage, something which made his new mentor Sting very happy. Yes, after having debuted at Winter is Coming the prior December, Sting was now hoping to guide Darby toward greater success in his career, with this being something which would eventually require him to step in the ring himself again. For the time being, though, he'd watch from the sidelines as his protege did his thing, with him going so hard here during his ongoing war with Team Taz that come Beach Break on February 3rd, another Dynamite special, he'd be given the week off. So what would make up the card of Beach Break in Darby's absence? Well, in what would prove to be a prelude to their much more famous match later on down the line, Britt Baker and Thunder Rosa would go one-on-one, with the Good Doctor winning this one. Elsewhere, meanwhile, after having been tricked into signing a contract which would allow Matt Hardy to manage all of his business, Adam Page found himself teaming with the Hardy brother to defeat Luther and Serpentico. Then, of course, there was the main event, a six-man tag pitting Kenny Omega and TNA's The Good Brothers against Jon Moxley, Pac, and Rey Fenix. This one would be most notable for the ending in which Kenta appeared and laid out Mox with a go to sleep. That's right, the Forbidden Door had finally been opened as, with this attack setting up a match between Kenta and Moxley for the IWGP United States title in an upcoming New Japan show, from here on in, AEW and New Japan Pro Wrestling would enter into a formal working relationship. And this meant that once lockdown restrictions were lifted and travel was made easier, there were suddenly a lot of dream matches on the table. For the time being, however, Kenta and Mox aside, these would have to wait as AEW instead focused on their own product, specifically on another upcoming Dynamite special entitled The Crossroads, a show which saw the in-ring debut of Jade Cargill as she teamed with Shaquille O'Neal, of all people, to defeat Cody Rhodes and Red Velvet. What would happen once that show was over? Well, after that, it would be time for the first pay-per-view of the year, Revolution, on March 7th. And this would be an event of highs and lows for All Elite Wrestling as it turned out, because while the Young Bucks would put out a solid men's tag team title defense against Chris Jericho and MJF, Christian Cage would come out to announce he was All Elite, and Darby Allin and Sting would have a very fun cinematic street fight against Brian Cage and Ricky Starks of Team Taz. Elsewhere, the women's division would continue to struggle during Hikaru Shida's women's world title defense against her former mentor back in Japan, Ryo Mizunami. Sure, Hangman Page's character arc would continue along nicely because, while the Dark Order courted him as the now babyface group hoped to find a new leader in the wake of Brody Lee's passing, the Cowboy finally shook off the shackles of Matt Hardy. Still, he wasn't willing to join the faction quite yet as, knowing what happened the last time he was part of a stable, he was unwilling to open himself up emotionally once more. And this would be his story as the next few months progressed and he was forced to reckon with his own self-confidence issues and fear of rejection. Needless to say then, this was a very layered and modern story for a wrestling company to tell, and it was one which kept fans engaged even when the lockdown was still in effect. One thing which was increasingly not holding their attention though was Cody Rhodes. No, by now, a backlash against Rhodes was starting to form as many AEW fans had grown tired of his character, and this backlash was in full effect as he hit the ring for the Face of the Revolution ladder match on March 7th, and there received a less than stellar response from the small crowd in attendance. But that wasn't the low light of this show. No, the low light would come in the main event because it was there that after Jon Moxley was able to earn an AEW Men's World Title rematch, he and Kenny Omega would go at it in an exploding barbed wire death match. Unfortunately though, while the match itself was pretty good, all anyone remembers about it now is the ending where, once Kenny retained through devious means and Eddie Kingston subsequently turned babyface by coming out to shield his old friend from an impending explosion, the bomb went off with a whimper rather than a bang. Yes, it was more of a sparkler show than anything else, and it gave AEW their first WrestleCrap moment as a result. Seriously, even today, this is still pretty funny to go back and watch. But Tony Khan and everyone else involved couldn't dwell on things for too long as they had a show to keep producing every week. And the next show of note which would come around would be the Dynamite special on March 17th entitled St. Patrick's Day Slam. What made this show so notable? Well, aside from a great match between Cody Rhodes and Penta El Cero Miedo, Jade Cargill would continue to dominate with a quick squash victory, all before Jon Moxley and Eddie Kingston partnered up to defeat the Good Brothers. Then there was the main event, probably the first great women's bout in AEW's history, as Britt Baker and Thunder Rosa absolutely killed it during a bloody lights out match, which was ultimately won by Rosa. That said, for as bloody as this was, it was nothing compared to what was coming because as the Inner Circle drama with MJF continued to develop, Max would eventually reveal that he'd been stringing Chris Jericho and crew along this whole time, also he could eventually turn on them and reveal his own heel stable, one made up of himself, Wardlow, Shawn Spears, and FTR, which would become known as the Pinnacle. How would the Inner Circle respond to this betrayal? Well, they'd turn babyface and formally challenge their new rivals to meet them inside of Blood and Guts. That's right, after the initial Blood and Guts match had been cancelled in early 2020, now we were finally going to get it on a special episode of Dynamite held on May 5th. And this would turn out to be quite a spectacle as in front of a Daily's Place which was now at around 15% capacity, all 10 men involved went to war and let the claret flow over the course of half an hour, with things eventually ending with the Inner Circle's surrender after MJF broke out of the two-ringed cage and threatened to dump Chris Jericho off the top. Of course, as soon as the Pinnacle had the victory though, Max would throw the demo god off the cage anyway because that was the dastardly kind of villain he was. And this would lead to the Inner Circle seeking revenge at Double or Nothing as the two factions battled it out again, this time in Stadium Stampede. But while the prior year's Stadium Stampede had been held in front of no fans, this time things would be different, because when Double or Nothing came around on May 30th, live from Daily's Place, it would be the first wrestling show to feature a capacity audience since the lockdown had begun. Yes, over 5,000 fans got to create a hell of an atmosphere here as things finally started to feel normal once again. And the show those fans were given on that evening was certainly a banger as, after things got going with Hangman Page, still unsure if he wanted to align himself with the Dark Order, scoring a win over Brian Cage, the Young Bucks would successfully defend their men's tag team titles in a very strong bout against Jon Moxley and Eddie Kingston. Then, once that was over, Jungle Boy would last eliminate Christian Cage in order to win the Casino Battle Royal, in the process earning himself a shot at the AEW Men's World Championship. Elsewhere, meanwhile, Miro, the man who'd won the TNT title from Darby Allin only a couple of weeks prior, would successfully defend against Lance Archer, all while Sting and Darby Allin were teaming up to defeat Ethan Page and Scorpio Sky. Hell, even the women's division would reach another rare high point here, as this would be the night where, after earning her shot at the gold at last, Britt Baker would defeat Hikaru Shida to end her reign as AEW Women's World Champion at an impressive 372 days. Honestly, the only low point of this show might have been the match between Cody and former Olympic boxer Anthony Ogogo, with the reason for this being that following his infamous promo, many fans who were still on the fence about the American Nightmare would take to booing him whenever he appeared on screen. But even if this was a lowlight, the show itself would end with two highlights, as once Kenny Omega successfully defended his men's world title in a banger of a three-way between him, Orange Cassidy, and Pac, Stadium Stampede would close out the show with all the same madness as the year prior, only with things this time ending in front of the live crowd as the Inner Circle stood tall. Clearly then, the message of this show was obvious for all to see, and that message was, with fans now back, AEW was stronger than ever. And this would continue to be the case as over the next month, while preparations were made for the company to return to a full touring schedule, Daly's Place got to see episodes of Dynamite which featured things like Kenny Omega defending his men's world title against Jungle Boy, Andrade El Idolo making his AEW debut, and Hangman Page coming ever closer to embracing the Dark Order as his new family. And that would all lead us to the Dynamite special entitled Road Rager on July 7th, as it was here that Tony Khan's promotion headed over to Miami and, in the process, became the first wrestling company to return to a full touring schedule since the lockdown had begun. What would Road Rager give fans who had shown up for that event? Well, outside of Andrade El Idolo making his in-ring debut for the company with a victory over Matt Sydal, Cody Rhodes would beat QT Marshall in a South Beach strap match. But the American Nightmare's subsequent celebration would be cut short when, as he was still standing in the middle of the ring, the lights cut out and then came back up again to reveal the arrival of Malachi Black. That's right, after being cut by WWE mere weeks prior, Black was now All Elite as well, and his first order of business in his new home would be to take out Rhodes by any means necessary. Not that this match would happen quite yet, though. No, before it came around, we'd first have another 2-week Dynamite special entitled Fyter Fest on July 14th and July 21st. And there, the capacity crowds in Texas were treated to quite a show as, while night one would feature such highlights as Jon Moxley successfully defending his IWGP United States title against Carl Anderson, Brian Cage getting the boot from Team Taz after Ricky Starks beat him for the FTW Championship, and Darby Allin beating Ethan Page in a coffin match, night two would in many ways go even further, with the likes of Chris Jericho beginning a series of labors he'd have to endure in order to get a one-on-one shot at MJF, Britt Baker successfully defending her women's world title against Nyla Rose, and Jon Moxley this time losing his IWGP US title during a Texas death match against Lance Archer. Needless to say then, AEW's momentum continued to be on a roll here. And that would still be the case as Fight for the Fallen happened on July 28th and saw not only Chris Jericho face off against Nick Gage in a full-blown death match, but also Hangman Page finally embrace the Dark Order by teaming with them to take on the Elite, only to then stumble once more as he lost the bout, and as a result, his #1 contendership spot for the men's world title. Hell, Dynamite Homecoming on August 4th would be a strong show too, as it featured the much-anticipated singles bout between Malachi Black and Cody Rhodes, with Malachi winning here. Where could All Elite Wrestling go from here? Well, how about the debut of a second weekly show? A show called Rampage, whose first episode would air 1 week later on August 13th, and which would come out of the gate strong with Christian Cage defeating Kenny Omega to win the TNA World title. Of course, it would really be the second episode of Rampage which got the most attention, however, as this was the episode where, after weeks of teasing, CM Punk returned to wrestling for the first time in 7 years. That's right, at the first dance on August 20th, an event held live from a sold-out United Center in Chicago, Punk would come out to an absolutely insane reaction, easily one of the biggest pops in wrestling history, to announce that he too was All Elite, with this bringing in an even greater audience for the company as emotions amongst the fan base were at an all-time high. What followed on from there? Well, in many ways what followed would be the peak of AEW in terms of overall popularity because, with All Out being on the horizon, the Second City Saint would challenge Darby Allin there to be his first opponent inside of an All Elite wrestling ring. What else was happening at All Out? Well, in front of another sold-out Chicago crowd, AEW would put on a great show, a show which served as another reminder of the company's mission statement to be an alternative to WWE, as they started out the evening with Miro successfully defending his TNT title against Eddie Kingston, and Jon Moxley getting the better of New Japan Pro Wrestling's Satoshi Kojima, all before he was confronted by Minoru Suzuki and challenged to a bout on an upcoming episode of Dynamite. Elsewhere, meanwhile, Britt Baker would defend her women's world title against Chris Statlander, Ruby Soho would debut during a women's casino battle royal and would go on to win the whole thing, Chris Jericho would pin MJF to end their feud, and in one of AEW's best bouts to date, the Lucha Bros would defeat the Young Bucks in a steel cage match to win the men's tag team titles. And that led us to the two main events of the night, The first of which saw CM Punk wrestle for the first time in 7 years as he took Darby Allin to the limit and ultimately beat him, in the process signaling that he was in Tony Khan's promotion to go all the way to the top. And once that was over, the final bout of the show would see Christian Cage go after Kenny Omega and his AEW Men's World title, and in the end, be unable to defeat him. But while this threatened to end the show on a down note, things would be turned right back up again when, during the post-match, the dual debuts of Adam Cole and Bryan Danielson occurred, with Cole immediately turning heel by aligning himself with his buddies in the Elite, and the American Dragon setting his sights on Kenny Omega in a dream match situation most people thought they'd never get to see. Obviously then, if you wanted to consider this AEW's high watermark as a promotion overall, it would be hard to argue with that opinion. Really, one of the only moments which might be able to top it would come a few weeks later on September 22nd and 24th, when in a dual Dynamite and Rampage special, Tony Khan and company headed over to New York City for their first ever stadium show, a show entitled Grand Slam, which saw over 20,000 fans pack themselves into Arthur Ashe Stadium in Queens to witness a first-time, only-time legendary encounter. Yes, the opening match on the first night here would be the much-anticipated dream match between Bryan Danielson and Kenny Omega, and while the men's world title wouldn't be on the line as a result of AEW's ranking system, what followed was a masterclass regardless, as both men took each other to the absolute limit in what still to this day ranks as one of the company's best ever matches. Who would win? No one, as it happened, because by the time all was said and done, things would be left unsettled with a 30-minute time limit draw, setting up a potential rematch we're still hoping to see one day. And once that epic was over, the rest of the two-night card would be filled out with other highlights like Malachi Black beating Cody Rhodes for a second time, Sting and Darby Allin defeating FTR, Britt Baker getting the better of the new #1 contender to her women's world title Ruby Soho, and CM Punk furthering a mini feud he'd started with Team Taz by taking on Powerhouse Hobbs one-on-one. That's right, this show was a roaring success. All the company had to do at this point was keep the momentum going by giving fans a satisfying climax to the story which had served as the spine of the entire promotion from day one, the saga of Hangman Adam Page. And after Page returned during a casino ladder match at the Dynamite 2nd Anniversary show in order to once more earn the #1 contendership spot, the final showdown between him and Kenny Omega would be set for Full Gear on November 13th. The only question left then was, would the Cowboys' self-confidence issues cause him to fail again, or would the new family he'd found in the Dark Order be enough to motivate him to finally win the big one a full 3 years after he'd appeared at an initial press conference announcing the formation of the promotion to say he wanted to be the first ever world champion? Well, before we found out the answer to this question, we'd first see the undercard of the show take place, an undercard which included MJF getting a pinfall victory over Darby Allin, the Lucha Bros successfully defending their men's tag team titles against FTR, and the trio of Christian Cage and the Jurassic Express getting the better of the Super Click threesome of Adam Cole and the Young Bucks. Then, as if that wasn't enough, Britt Baker would defend her women's world title against Ty Mello as that division continued to struggle overall. CM Punk and Eddie Kingston would have an all-timer of a fight, and fresh off of losing his TNT title to Sammy Guevara, Miro would fail to beat Bryan Danielson in the finals of a men's world championship eliminator tournament, with this making the American Dragon the next #1 contender to the gold. Who would he be facing though? Well, that would be decided in the main event, as after 3 years of build and 1 year after their first singles bout at Full Gear 2020, Hangman Page would finally challenge Kenny Omega for the AEW Men's World title. And in the perfect climax to the story, after a war which went on for 25 minutes, the Cowboy would win the gold to become the 4th ever person to call themselves the top guy in All Elite Wrestling. Needless to say then, the sight of him celebrating in the ring with the Dark Order after the fact was an emotional one, and it served as a great capper to what, in many ways, was the end point of the first era of the promotion. Of course, it wasn't like things were going to stop here or anything though. No, as always, the show would go on as a new chapter began, a chapter which now saw the Hangman as the man to beat, and his first challenger, Bryan Danielson, would waste no time in letting him know he wanted to take the belt away from him as soon as possible. So it was then that only 1 week after MJF arrived in his hometown of Long Island to a Bizarro World Heroes welcome, when he not only won the Dynamite Diamond Ring for a 3rd year running, but also started a feud with CM Punk, Winter is Coming would take place again on December 15th and would see Adam Page and the American Dragon have another excellent match in a long list of them for AEW this year, a match that went a full hour and left things unsettled once the time limit ran out. What did this mean for Page and Danielson going forward? Well, it meant a rematch would be on the cards, one which would come in early 2022. In the meantime, however, AEW would close out their most successful year yet with a Dynamite and Rampage special entitled Holiday Bash on December 22nd and 25th. And there, as Adam Cole celebrated the arrival of Red Dragon in Jacksonville with a win over Orange Cassidy, the rest of the show would see not only CM Punk continue to close in on MJF, but Cody Rhodes become a 3-time TNT champion after beating Sammy Guevara for the honor. Would this mark the start of a resurgence for the American Nightmare in AEW? Not exactly, but that's a story for another day. As for 2021 though, this was certainly a period that proved the promotion showed that they were here to stay for the long haul. It's just a shame 2022 would see some cracks begin to show in the armor for the first time then, as Mindy's Bakery and an infamous press conference were about to enter the fray. 2022 was a year which saw All Elite Wrestling come in riding a wave of momentum. But as we would soon learn, it would also be the year in which it hit its first major roadblock. But how did it all happen, and how would it affect things going forward? Well, that's exactly what we are going to be looking at right now in AEW in 2022, a year in review. When we last left off, CM Punk had returned to wrestling for the first time in 7 years to sign on the dotted line with Tony Khan. Britt Baker was ruling the still struggling women's division, and Hangman Page was the reigning and defending men's world champion. But there was a challenger to his crown, and this challenger was Bryan Danielson, the man who'd taken him to a 60-minute time limit draw at Winter is Coming in December 2021. So in order to settle who the best was once and for all then, the rematch would be booked for the first episode of Dynamite in the new year, with this one seeing the American Dragon do his first job in AEW as the Cowboy fully solidified himself as the man. What else was happening on this stacked show which represented the debut of the promotion on TBS? Well, in fitting with the theme of the night, the first ever TBS champion would be crowned when Jade Cargill beat Ruby Soho for the honor. And after that was done, Jurassic Express managed to upset the reigning men's tag team champions, the Lucha Bros, to take home the belts for themselves. When it came to the TNT title, however, well, the situation with that strap would be a little more complicated, because after Cody Rhodes was unable to make a scheduled date as a result of illness, Tony Khan decided to crown an interim champion in Sammy Guevara at Battle of the Belts on January 8th. And this would lead us into Beach Break on January 26th, the show where a ladder match to crown the lineal TNT champion would ultimately be won by Guevara. More importantly than that, however, this match also served as Cody Rhodes' last in AEW, because with his contract running out here, he'd choose not to renew and would instead make the jump over to WWE. Why had the American Nightmare left the company he'd helped to form? Well, this has never come out, but it's likely a combination of various reasons, including Cody feeling like he wasn't being fully given his respect. Hell, some have even suggested he saw the writing on the wall in terms of what was to come with CM Punk. Whatever the reason though, the end result was the same, and that was, going forward, All Elite Wrestling was going to be without one of their founding fathers. Of course, while this would be a blow to the promotion, a bigger one than anyone realized at the time, AEW had no choice but to push forward. And they do so by continuing on with their wave of momentum heading into Revolution on March 6th. What happened at this show? Well, a mere 4 days after Tony Khan announced he had purchased Ring of Honor and would be running it concurrently as a separate promotion, Swerve Strickland would come out to the ring to announce he was All Elite. All while in-ring bangers would include Eddie Kingston getting the better of Chris Jericho, Jurassic Express successfully defending their men's tag team titles in a three-way bout, pitting them against both Red Dragon and the Young Bucks, and Wardlow earning a future TNT title shot after winning the Face of the Revolution ladder match. But that was far from all that was happening at Revolution. No, these were just the tasters in many ways, because once those bouts were done, Jade Cargill and Britt Baker would each defend their TBS and Women's World titles against Ty Mello and Thunder Rosa respectively. And once that was over, fresh off of having beaten CM Punk twice in one night in Chicago on the February 2nd episode of Dynamite, MJF would find himself having to be on the receiving end of a beatdown, this time during his bloody dog collar match against the Second City Saint. Who won that one? Well, after Wardlow finally decided he'd had enough of MJF and gave Punk the Dynamite Diamond Ring to use as his weapon, it would be Phil Brooks who came out the victor, with this putting a capper on one of AEW's best feuds ever to this day. And that still wasn't the end of the show, because there were two main events to come. The first of which saw the Blackpool Combat Club be formed when, after Jon Moxley returned from a stint in rehab to defeat Bryan Danielson, real-life mentor to both men William Regal would arrive in All Elite Wrestling to convince both men to join forces. Then, of course, there was the final match of the evening, the one pitting AEW Men's World Champion Hangman Adam Page against Adam Cole. Here, despite Cole putting on his best effort, it would be the Cowboy who came out on top. And that would lead us into the next pay-per-view cycle, one which saw the TNT title lose some of its initial luster, as over the next couple of months, the belt would be hot-shotted between Scorpio Sky, Sammy Guevara, and back to Scorpio Sky again. Still, at least AEW remains strong in other areas, with this being evident at St. Patrick's Day Smash on March 16th when, not only did the Blackpool Combat Club establish themselves as a morally ambiguous force to be reckoned with during their win over the Best Friends, but after Jeff Hardy joined the promotion, he'd team up with his brother Matt to get the better of Private Party. And that's not even getting into the most notable segment of this evening, the Steel Cage main event, which saw Thunder Rosa finally dethrone Britt Baker as Women's World Champion a full year after their famous Lights Out brawl. Yes, the women's division in All Elite Wrestling, while still struggling overall, was hitting a little bit of a high here, and that would lead to it ending up getting one of the better bouts of the night at Double or Nothing on May 29th, as there, the newly crowned champ would successfully defend against Serena Deeb. As to the rest of this stacked show, well, as AEW returned to Las Vegas for the first time since the lockdown, the crowd would be treated to an undercard which saw Jade Cargill defend her TBS title against Anna Jay, the House of Black get the better of Death Triangle, and Paige Van Zant have her lone bout under Tony Khan's employ when she teamed with Ethan Page and Scorpio Sky to defeat Sammy Guevara, Frankie Kazarian, and Ty Mello. Elsewhere, meanwhile, the first annual Owen Hart Cup, a single elimination tournament held in conjunction with Dr. Martha Hart and the Owen Hart Foundation, would see Adam Cole win the men's bracket after beating Samoa Joe in the final, and then his real-life partner Britt Baker come out victorious in the women's bracket after she managed to best Ruby Soho. And how about the fact that, in the opener, under a cloud of controversy in which it wasn't clear what exactly was going on with MJF or whether he was even going to show up to the event, he eventually got into the ring to do a quick job to Wardlow, in the process ending their feud. And that would lead to a story the next night on Dynamite in which Max cut a work-shoot promo where he apparently quit the company, frustrated as he was over how he was being treated by his boss when he was such a key part of its rapid growth. As for Double or Nothing, however, well, this would continue on with Jurassic Express defending their men's tag team titles against both Swerve and Our Glory and Team Taz, all before a direct shot of cocaine was delivered to the audience in the form of one of the wildest match types in recent memory, Anarchy in the Arena. That's right, in the spiritual successor to Stadium Stampede, Chris Jericho would lead his new stable, the Jericho Appreciation Society, into battle, a stable made up of him, Daniel Garcia, Jake Hager, Cool Hand Angelo Parker, and Daddy Magic Matt Menard. What had happened to the Inner Circle? Well, the Demo God had turned on them in the lead up to the event after apparently having no more use for them. Needless to say then, his opponents that night would include former Inner Circle members Proud and Powerful, as well as not just Eddie Kingston, but also the Blackpool Combat Club. And what followed on from here was 23 minutes of pure madness, as while Wild Thing played over the loudspeakers on a loop, New Jack style, for much of the proceeding, Anarchy was indeed brought to the arena. Hell, at one point, a blood-soaked Eddie Kingston would even memorably stumble down to the ring with a canister of gasoline, which he hoped to use to set someone on fire. In the end, though, this wouldn't work out for him, and it would be the Jericho Appreciation Society who came out the victors, with this setting up fans nicely for the main event, the AEW Men's World Title bout between Hangman Page and CM Punk. Yes, it was perhaps the most unpredictable world title match in AEW to date, with fans pretty much being split down the middle on who they hoped to see win. But when all was said and done, it would be Punk who was getting his arm raised as he became the 5th men's world champion in Tony Khan's promotion. Sadly though, any Summer of Punk situation this was supposed to start would be cut short when on the very next episode of Dynamite, the Second City Saint broke his foot while diving into the crowd in celebration. What did this mean for the top prize at AEW, at least as far as the men were concerned? Well, it meant that while Punk was out healing up, an interim world champion would have to be crowned in its place. But that champ wouldn't be crowned for a few weeks yet, and while we were waiting for that to happen, more noteworthy moments would occur when only 1 week after Wardlow won the TNT title from Scorpio Sky, the Dynamite and Rampage specials entitled Road Rager on June 15th and 17th would see highlights such as Toni Storm establishing herself in Jacksonville with a win over Britt Baker, Willow Nightingale also making a name for herself during a losing effort against Jade Cargill for the TBS title, the Young Bucks becoming 2-time men's tag team champions when they got the better of Jurassic Express in a ladder match, and Will Ospreay arrive in AEW by making short work of Dax Harwood. Why was Will Ospreay in AEW now? Well, because after a formal working relationship had been established between Tony Khan's company and New Japan Pro Wrestling the year prior, the summer of 2022 had seen things be taken to the next level with the announcement of Forbidden Door, a special crossover pay-per-view between both promotions to be held on June 26th. And when the time for that event came, it certainly wouldn't disappoint. No, in a true all-star encounter, this show would see not only FTR briefly unify the ROH and IWGP tag team titles with a win over the United Empire and Roppongi Vice, and PAC become the inaugural AEW All-Atlantic champion by beating Malachi Black, Miro, and Clark Connors in a four-way, but Thunder Rosa successfully defend her AEW Women's World title against Toni Storm, and Will Ospreay do the same during his IWGP United States title bout against Orange Cassidy. As for what happened outside of this, well, after Darby Allin and Sting teamed up with Shingo Takagi to take on the Young Bucks and El Phantasmo, new Blackpool Combat Club member Claudio Castagnoli would sub in for an injured Bryan Danielson to get the better of Zack Sabre Jr. Switchblade Jay White would retain the IWGP World Heavyweight title in a four-way, pitting him against Hangman Adam Page, Kazuchika Okada, and Adam Cole. And in the main event of the evening, Jon Moxley would best Hiroshi Tanahashi to become the interim AEW Men's World Champion. And what makes this latter result even wilder is that, as a result of his contract having come due by then and him not having signed a new one yet, the title run which subsequently happened would all take place while Mox was technically a free agent. That's right, when Moxley walked into Blood and Guts on the following episode of Dynamite to team up with fellow BCC members Claudio Castagnoli and Wheeler Yuta, as well as Eddie Kingston and Proud and Powerful, in order to get revenge over the Jericho Appreciation Society for the events of the Stadium Stampede, he'd do so as a man who, if he felt so inclined, could have walked onto Monday Night Raw with the opposition's world title in tow. Obviously, though, this was not something he was going to do, and that would continue to be the case during subsequent weeks as he defended against challengers like Brody King, Rush, Chris Jericho, and Konosuke Takeshita. What was happening in AEW during this period? Well, at the 2-week Dynamite and Rampage special Fyter Fest, held between July 13th and July 22nd, not only would Wardlow retain his TNT title against Orange Cassidy, but fresh off of betraying Jungle Boy, Christian Cage and Luchasaurus would continue to reign supreme with a victory over the Varsity Blondes, all while Swerve and Our Glory would beat the Young Bucks to become men's tag team champions. And when that show was over, and it was time for Fight for the Fallen on July 27th and 29th, not only would Thunder Rosa once again retain her AEW Women's World title, this time against Tokyo Joshi Pro Wrestling's Miyu Yamashita, but Daniel Garcia would score a major win over Bryan Danielson, right before Hook snagged the FTW title from Ricky Starks, and in the process, caused the implosion of Team Taz. Then, of course, there was Quake by the Lake, another Dynamite and Rampage special held on August 10th and 12th. Aside from the aforementioned Jon Moxley-Chris Jericho bout for the interim AEW Men's World title, this evening also saw Darby Allin beat Brody King in a coffin match, and Jade Cargill rack up another TBS title defense against Madison Rayne. More importantly than this, however, it saw the return of CM Punk to challenge Mox for a showdown to crown the lineal Men's World Champion on the August 24th episode of TV. And to the shock of many, this showdown would see the BCC member absolutely squash Punk in just a couple of minutes to become the first ever two-time champ, in the process setting up a Rocky III style storyline where, still not 100% following his injury, the Second City Saint would have to pick himself up in time for the rematch at All Out, live from Chicago on September 4th. Obviously then, heading into All Out, excitement was high, and that excitement would be rewarded when, as the night got started, a mysterious masked man came out to the strains of Sympathy for the Devil, then proceeded to win the Casino ladder match to earn a future men's world title match. And after that was over, the Elite became the inaugural AEW Trios champions when they got the better of Hangman Adam Page and the Dark Order. But it was only the start, as it turned out, because following on from there, Jade Cargill would retain her TBS title against Athena, Swerve and Our Glory would survive a truly unique "Oh Scissor Me Daddy" chant to get the better of their opponents for the night, the Acclaimed, Christian Cage would beat Jungle Boy in a singles bout, and Chris Jericho would manage to best Bryan Danielson one-on-one. Then, of course, there was the women's world title situation, a situation which, following Thunder Rosa's injury, saw Toni Storm win a four-way against Britt Baker, Jamie Hayter, and Hikaru Shida to become the interim champion. That would be followed by Darby Allin, Miro, and an increasingly Daredevil-esque Sting teaming up to beat the House of Black. And once this was over, CM Punk and Jon Moxley would meet in the main event for the AEW Men's World title, with Punk regaining his gold here, only to then be confronted by the man who had won the Casino Ladder match earlier in the evening, now unmasking himself as MJF. Yes, it was all heading toward one final showdown between CM Punk and MJF for the gold, but in the end, that would never take place because in the now infamous post-show press conference, the Second City Saint would go on a tirade where he buried the entire company, specifically the Elite. What had caused this to happen? Well, after Punk's debut in AEW coincided with his former best friend Colt Cabana being pulled from TV, many in the promotion, most notably the Young Bucks, came to believe that Phil Brooks had used his backstage power to make this happen, something he, for his part, denied. Needless to say then, this led to tensions bubbling up between both sides over the months which followed, tensions which only got worse when, in the lead-up to Double or Nothing, Adam Page had publicly called out Punk during his equally as infamous Workers' Rights promo. And that angered the champ so much, he'd let it all out in front of the media after All Out, all while he worked his way through a box of Mindy's Bakery muffins. What happened after this? Well, upon hearing what Punk said, the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega headed to his locker room with AEW's head of legal, Mega Parek, in order to confront him, and a legitimate brawl broke out. That's right, it was Brawl Out. And the aftermath of this would be huge, as not only would CM Punk and the Elite be stripped of their Men's World and Trio titles respectively with immediate effect, but all four men would be suspended until further notice as an internal investigation was carried out. Of course, given Punk had torn his tricep during the Jon Moxley match at All Out, he was going to be out for a long time anyway. The only question at this point was, would he be back at all, or would Tony Khan execute the nuclear option and fire him? Well, that was a question we'd have to wait for a while to get the answer to as it happened. And in the meantime, some of the fan base would begin to turn on the boss as the weakness in his leadership style suddenly became evident. On screen, though, it would be business as normal, as after new Trios champions were quickly crowned in the form of Death Triangle, AEW would return to Arthur Ashe Stadium on September 21st for Grand Slam, an event where, aside from Chris Jericho beating Claudio Castagnoli to win the ROH World title, Pac and Toni Storm successfully defending their All-Atlantic and Interim Women's World titles respectively, and the Acclaimed dethroning incoming Men's Tag Team Champion Swerve in Our Glory, a finals of a mini-tournament to crown a new AEW Men's World Champion would see Jon Moxley defeat Bryan Danielson to become the first ever three-time champ. That's right, and what was now becoming a recurring pattern, whenever something went wrong in AEW, the belt would be given to Mox in order to stabilize the situation. And after defending that belt against Adam Page at Title Tuesday on October 18th, in a match which had to be stopped early on account of the Hangman legitimately getting knocked out cold, Moxley would head into Full Gear ready to take on the challenge of MJF. What else was taking place at Full Gear? Well, while the new All-Atlantic champion Orange Cassidy wouldn't make the card, Jungle Boy would, as he managed to win a steel cage match against his former partner, Luchasaurus. Elsewhere, meanwhile, newcomer to AEW, Saraya, scored a win of her own over Britt Baker. Samoa Joe won the TNT title in a three-way against Wardlow and Powerhouse Hobbs, and Jamie Hayter defeated Toni Storm to become the new AEW Women's World Champion. Why was she not considered an interim champion? Well, after it became clear Thunder Rosa's injury was going to last a lot longer than expected, she'd formally vacate here, with this also meaning that Toni Storm's first reign would retroactively be considered a full one. Elsewhere, meanwhile, after their 3-month suspension ended, the Elite would return to the promotion they helped to found in order to try and win back the Trios belts they'd never lost. Unfortunately for them, though, despite being the favorites headed in, by the time all was said and done, Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks would be doing the honors for the incoming champs, Death Triangle. And after that was done, the main event would take place and would see MJF, after weeks of teasing a babyface turn, surprise everyone by convincing William Regal to go heel and join his side, as together they were able to get the men's world title off of Jon Moxley and around the Devil's waist. Yes, at just 26 years old, Maxwell Jacob Friedman had climbed the mountain to become the guy in All Elite Wrestling. And after getting what he wanted, he'd kick Regal to the curb on the following episode of Dynamite, in the process writing the Englishman off of TV so that he could return to WWE. What happened after this? Well, at Winter is Coming on December 14th, in a match in which both the men's world title and the Dynamite Diamond Ring were on the line, the new champ would successfully defend against Ricky Starks. And aside from that, this show would also be the one which saw the fourth match in what was now being considered a best-of-7 series between the Elite and Death Triangle for the Trios titles, with this one being won by the champs again as they took their lead to 3-1. Just as well this series was happening as 2022 came to an end then, because so well received would it be, it would also serve as an anchor for the Holiday Bash and New Year's Bash Dynamite and Rampage specials held between December 21st and December 30th, with the 5th and 6th bouts taking place here, where the Elite were able to pull things back to 3-3. But even if these were some pretty spectacular contests for the year to go out on, there was still an overall sense that this was the 12-month period where the first whispers of the downturn of AEW had begun. Why was that? Well, mostly it was the events of Brawl Out, an event which showed the behind-the-scenes weaknesses of a promotion which had, in many ways, grown too big, too fast, way before it had the proper infrastructure in place to accommodate its current scale. But it wasn't just that. No, aside from the whole Brawl Out situation, a situation which would continue to linger like a black cloud over Jacksonville for as long as the Second City Saint was out injured and his status remained in open question, there was also the exit of Cody Rhodes, something which, in hindsight, served as an early spark in what would become WWE's creative resurgence on their side of the fence. The only question left then, now that it had been seriously wounded for the first time in its history, could AEW right the ship in 2023, something which still felt possible on account of the fact they had a 26-year-old prodigy on top of the promotion now. We'll find out in 2023. 2023 wasn't the best year for AEW. Why is that? Well, there would be a full turning of the tides here in terms of who the most popular promotion was amongst fans. That said, this isn't to suggest there weren't high points for Tony Khan's company at this point too. So with this in mind, let's break the whole thing down and see what the peaks and troughs were in AEW in 2023, a year in review. When we last left off, MJF had just won the men's world title, Jamie Hayter was the women's world champion, and overall there was a sense that WWE was pulling ahead in the war over fan perception. And this was something AEW would continue to struggle with throughout the year which followed, as, now with their top heel Vince McMahon gone, and the Elite CM Punk drama hanging over everything like a black cloud, much of the early goodwill Tony Khan had cultivated was fading away fast. How would he try to win this goodwill back then? Well, by doing what AEW did best, putting on an excellent wrestling show every week. And that would lead to some big moments happening on Dynamite across January and February, with perhaps the most notable of these being Konosuke Takeshita rising up the card with a one-on-one bout against MJF on February 8th, the Guns winning the men's tag team titles from the Acclaimed on that same evening, and the TNT bouncing around between Darby Allin and Samoa Joe for a while. Of course, when it came to the latter of these three events though, rather than feel like a positive, all it did was help to further devalue the TNT title and add to the growing sense that, unlike with the first few years of AEW, the booking was starting to get noticeably weaker here. Still, at least there would be a high watermark moment on the January 11th episode of Dynamite, as this was when the excellent Best of 7 series over the Trios titles between the Elite and Death Triangle ended in a stellar Escalera de la Muerte match, one which saw Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks come out as the two-time champions. And all that would lead us into the first pay-per-view of the year, Revolution, on March 5th. A show which, even if week-to-week TV was starting to lose its luster, continued a string of fantastic big shows. What delivered on this show specifically? Well, after the night began with Ricky Starks and Jungle Boy scoring big wins over Chris Jericho and Christian Cage respectively, 2 titles would be successfully defended when the Guns outlasted 3 other teams in the men's tag team title match, and Jamie Hayter successfully defended her women's world title against Saraya. Of course, not everyone was walking out with the titles they came in with here though. No, elsewhere on the show, the Elite would drop the Trios titles to the House of Black, all while Wardlow would become a 2-time TNT champion after getting the better of Samoa Joe. All that was left to get to after this then were the 2 main events, and each of these would deliver in the end, with the first seeing Hangman Page and Jon Moxley finish their series which had been going on across Dynamite with the original Texas Death Match between the pair, one which was ultimately won by the Cowboy. As to the other main event, the closing bout of the evening, well, that would see Bryan Danielson challenge MJF for the men's world title in an Iron Man match. And this one turned out to be nothing less than a modern classic, with the winner once things were over being Maxwell Jacob Friedman after edging out the American Dragon at 4-3. So now that the Dragon had been felled then, it was just a question of who was going to step up to the champ next as he continued his reign of dominance. Before we'd find out who that was though, more weekly TV highlights would include FTR beating the Guns for the men's tag team titles on April 5th, All well lowlights included seeing the TNT title bounce around even more, with it this time going from Wardlow to Powerhouse Hobbs and then back to Wardlow again. Was there anything else notable happening on Dynamite and Rampage outside of this? Well, in what it was currently becoming one of AEW's best storylines ever, Orange Cassidy was engaged in his lazy workhorse run with the now rebranded International Championship, with the idea here being that he was defending the belt on a near weekly basis, and that every time he did squeak out a victory, he was getting more and more beaten down. Obviously then, this was painting an increasingly large target on his back, one which saw him have a full 20 challengers at Double or Nothing on May 28th. That's right, the mid-card strap would be put up for grabs in a blackjack battle royal at this show, with OC somehow managing to leave things with the belt still around his waist. What else was happening on the undercard here? Well, after being out for almost a year following a concussion, Adam Cole would return to defeat Chris Jericho in an unsanctioned match which saw Sabu appear, and once that was done, FTR, Wardlow, and the House of Black would retain their tag team, TNT, and Trios titles respectively. Elsewhere, meanwhile, the ladies were showing out, as even if the division was still struggling overall, they made the most of what they had here when Toni Storm beat Jamie Hayter in a quick squash match to win the Women's World title for a second time, something which was necessary on account of Hayter going into the bout with a back injury. And once that was over, after taking her TBS title reign to a whopping 508 days in length, Jade Cargill would finally be bested by a returning Chris Statlander, with this spelling the beginning of the end for Cargill in AEW, as her contract was about to expire and she was about to jump over to WWE. One person who wasn't going anywhere, however, was MJF. No, he was still all in on being all elite, as he was still the men's world champion. And at Double or Nothing, he'd keep his run going by successfully defending against Darby Allin, Jungle Boy, and Sammy Guevara in a 4 Pillars 4-way. But that still wasn't all Double or Nothing had to offer, because in the main event, Anarchy in the Arena would return, and once more would deliver exactly what it advertised, as, while Wild Thing again played on a loop over much of the proceedings, the Blackpool Combat Club were able to get the better of the newly reformed Elite. Yes, after their on-screen relationship had fallen apart in 2020, Hangman Page had finally been reunited with Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks. That said, their real-life issues with CM Punk still persisted, someone who was now on the verge of returning from injury. So at this point then, Tony Khan needed to make a decision about whether he was going to fire Punk for his conduct during Brawl Out or welcome him back into the fold. And in the end, the boss would choose the latter option. How would he solve the problem of the Elite not wanting to work with Punk anymore? Well, with a soft brand split. That's right, with the announcement that WBD was now giving AEW a new 2-hour weekly live show entitled Collision every Saturday, it presented the perfect opportunity to keep the two sides apart, as going forward, Dynamite would be the exclusive home of the Founding Fathers, and Collision would be the only place you would see the Second City Saint. So it was then that on June 17th, the debut episode of Collision aired, with Phil Brooks coming out to a hero's welcome in Chicago, where he cut a typically fiery promo announcing that he was back. Unfortunately though, by the time Forbidden Door, the now annual crossover event between AEW and New Japan Pro Wrestling, came around a week later on June 25th, we'd no longer be in Chicago. And that night, the Toronto crowd would mercilessly boo Punk out of the building as he challenged Satoshi Kojima, something which would be a recurring pattern going forward. What else was happening at Forbidden Door outside of Punk being the most hated man in AEW? Well, in keeping with the crossover theme of the show, lots of New Japan talent would appear as Orange Cassidy successfully defended his international title against Zack Sabre Jr., Daniel Garcia, and Katsuyori Shibata. Sting and Darby Allin teamed up with Tetsuya Naito to get the better of Chris Jericho, Sammy Guevara, and Minoru Suzuki. MJF retained his AEW Men's World title against Hiroshi Tanahashi, and Sonata kept a hold of his IWGP World Heavyweight title following a challenge from Jungle Boy. Elsewhere, meanwhile, following on from their first bout earlier that year at Wrestle Kingdom 17, Kenny Omega and Will Ospreay would do battle over the IWGP United States Heavyweight Championship, with the Aerial Assassin managing to come out the winner here after he was forced to bust out the rarely seen most dangerous move in all of wrestling, the Tiger Driver 91. But even that wasn't the main event of the show. No, the main event would see no titles on the line, as it would be all about the first time ever dream match between Bryan Danielson and Kazuchika Okada. Who would win this one? Well, after legitimately breaking his arm 15 minutes in, the American Dragon would somehow manage to come out on top. That said, the price he'd pay for this would be missing out on the next few months of TV, with that meaning he'd be absent for the rest of the second annual Owen Hart Cup, a tournament which played out over the course of the month which followed, and which would ultimately see the winners of the men's and women's legs be Ricky Starks and growing fan favorite Willow Nightingale. Obviously then, this was a major moment for each of these two performers, with it elevating Starks in particular into a TV feud with CM Punk over the real World Championship. You see, given he'd never actually been beaten for the men's world title when he was stripped of it back in 2022, the Second City Saint had now taken to carrying an unsanctioned version of the strap around with him, one which was spray painted with an X symbol. And that wasn't the only title which was pretty much exclusive to Collision here, as elsewhere on the show, the TNT title, which was now officially in the possession of Luchasaurus, but in truth was actually being kept by his leader Christian Cage, was also only to be found on Saturday nights as a result of the soft brand extension. Unfortunately though, by now it was clear that this soft brand extension, while doing its main job of keeping CM Punk and the Elite apart, was not doing much to quell the tension between the two sides, with Punk reportedly still not happy behind the scenes. And this would soon cause the situation to explode in another very public way. Before it did though, over on Dynamite, TV was hitting a high point as on July 19th, it would be time for the third annual Blood and Guts, a match which this time pitted the Golden Elite of Omega, the Bucks, Hangman, and Kota Ibushi against the Blackpool Combat Club trio of Jon Moxley, Claudio Castagnoli, and Wheeler Yuta, as well as Mercenaries for Hire, Konosuke Takeshita, and Pac. Who won this one? Well, that would be the Golden Elite. And this wasn't the only big win which happened at Blood and Guts, as earlier on in the undercard, Jack Perry had cemented a recent heel turn by beating Hook for the FTW title. Where would AEW go from here? Well, after Fyter Fest and Fight for the Fallen both came and went with far less spectacle this year outside of a couple more Orange Cassidy international title defenses, the 200th episode of Dynamite would take place on August 2nd and would see Hikaru Shida defeat Toni Storm to become the two-time AEW Women's World Champion, in the process sending the now former champ on a mental spiral which would soon see her transform into her final form, the Golden Era Hollywood film starlet, Timeless Toni Storm. Of course, while Timeless Toni would eventually become arguably the biggest thing in all of AEW, for the time being the real big story remained the drama between the Elite and CM Punk. And that would be a big story heading into All In on September 27th, a show named after that famous indie event which served as the precursor for the company's existence. But it wouldn't be the only big story here, because in All Elite Wrestling's first show outside of North America, the company had managed to wildly exceed even the most optimistic of expectations here by putting a staggering 72,000 people inside of Wembley Stadium. That's right, this would have been an incredible achievement for any wrestling company, let alone one that was only 4 years old. So as you would expect, when the company headed over to Wembley on August 27th, the atmosphere would be incredible as the gargantuan stadium was packed out to the rafters. What card would this crowd be given? Well, that was less impressive, as for some baffling reason, it would be more of a house show in terms of in-ring action, with the pre-show seeing the growing bromance between MJF and Adam Cole leading to them beating Aussie Open for the Ring of Honor tag team titles, all before Hook then won the FTW title back from Jack Perry. Then in the undercard of the main show, CM Punk came out to another chorus of boos for what would turn out to be his last match in AEW when he beat Samoa Joe for the real world title. Jay White, Juice Robinson, and Konosuke Takeshita would get the better of Kenny Omega, Hangman Page, and Kota Ibushi, and in a revival of Stadium Stampede, Eddie Kingston, Penta El Cero Miedo, Orange Cassidy, and the Best Friends would score a win over Jon Moxley, Claudio Castagnoli, Wheeler Yuta, and Proud and Powerful. Outside of that, FTR successfully defended their men's tag team titles against the Young Bucks. Saraya won the women's world title in front of her home country after beating Hikaru Shida, Toni Storm, and Britt Baker in a four-way, and Sting continued to wow everyone with what he was capable of during a tag team coffin match, pitting him and Darby Allin against Swerve Strickland and Christian Cage. Then, in the semi-mains, the Acclaimed would win back the Trios titles from the House of Black, and Will Ospreay would appear on loan from New Japan to get the better of Chris Jericho, though not before the Demo God aped that famous Queen gig at Wembley by singing himself down to the ring. Really though, once this show was over, aside from the gigantic attendance, there would be two big talking points coming out of All In. The first of which was the main event, which saw the brochachos of MJF and Adam Cole go at it one-on-one over the men's world title in the main event, with Max coming out of that one the winner as his reign continued. And then of course there was the backstage fight between CM Punk and friend of the Elite Jack Perry, a fight which happened in between the pre-show and the main card, and which would lead to the Second City Saint being suspended, and then, once an internal investigation was carried out by a committee which included Bryan Danielson, fired less than a week later. Yes, after a year of chaos, the relationship between Punk and AEW finally came to an end, and the black cloud he left would continue to linger for a while yet, as the Wembley incident only served to reinforce the idea that Tony Khan had let things get completely out of control. Really, what All Elite Wrestling desperately needed here was a blowaway show, and luckily that's exactly what they would get when just 7 days after All In, All Out took place in Chicago, Illinois. What happened on this show? Well, just an all-round excellent pay-per-view, which saw such highlights as Luchasaurus defending his TNT title against Darby Allin, Chris Statlander doing the same with her TBS title against Ruby Soho, and a returning Bryan Danielson elevating Ricky Starks during an absolutely brutal strap match. Elsewhere, meanwhile, Konosuke Takeshita scored a major singles win over Kenny Omega during a great bout, and after 326 days, Orange Cassidy's epic international title reign finally ended at the hands of Jon Moxley. Of course, there were some low points here too, such as when MJF and Adam Cole defended their ROH tag team titles against the Dark Order. Why was this a low point? Well, by now, the whole brochachos angle was starting to jump the shark, as the general sentiment was it was all getting too sports entertainment, in the process stripping AEW of its identity as an alternative to WWE. And that was starting to turn off a large portion of the fan base who were already frustrated following the handling of the CM Punk situation. Could things be tinkered with in order to make the brochachos feel more in line with what AEW had been originally? No, unfortunately, as following Grand Slam on September 20th and 22nd, the Jacksonville promotions returned to Arthur Ashe Stadium, Adam Cole would be taken out of action after suffering a freak ankle break during the main event men's world title match between MJF and Samoa Joe, with this causing things to segue into the infamous Devil storyline, where a mystery figure began taunting the champ every week in full Black Scorpion style. Yes, to look back on it now, this was certainly a low point for AEW. Thankfully then, there were other things to enjoy about the promotion at the time for those growing increasingly frustrated with the main event scene. And one of these things would be the excellent new heel character of Christian Cage, scourge of fatherless children everywhere, someone who, on the September 23rd episode of Collision, officially became the TNT champion after he beat both Luchasaurus and Darby Allin for it in a three-way bout. That said, this wouldn't be the end of the beef between Christian and Darby. No, the final blow-off in their feud wouldn't come until Wrestle Dream on October 1st, a show which was created as a tribute to Antonio Inoki. Here, in the main event of the evening, the champ and the challenger battled it out in a 2 out of 3 falls bout, with the ultimate winner at 2-1 being Cage. But as he was celebrating his big victory in the ring, the Canadian would be forced to contend with a ghost from his past as Adam Copeland debuted in AEW, much to the delight of the live audience. What else was happening at Wrestle Dream? Well, aside from Eddie Kingston, the dual ROH champion and NJP Strong Openweight champion, putting both of his belts up for grabs during his physical battle with Katsuyori Shibata, Bryan Danielson had another all-timer, this time against Zack Sabre Jr., and in the start of what might be AEW's best feud ever, Swerve Strickland would break through the glass ceiling in a big way with a major win over Hangman Adam Page. Yes, the rivalry which would carry the company through its lowest lows in terms of perception had now begun, and as the weeks went on, it would only intensify with things like Swerve staging an invasion of the Cowboys' home. Elsewhere in AEW, meanwhile, as Tony Khan was announcing the signing of a new TV deal with WBD, which made them the second most successful wrestling company in history, over on Collision, Ricky Starks and Big Bill were beating FTR to win the men's tag team titles. And on top of that, at Title Tuesday on October 10th, Rey Fenix, the man who'd upset Jon Moxley for the international title a month prior, would drop the belt to Orange Cassidy as OC started his second reign, all before MJF won the Dynamite Diamond Ring for a 4th year in a row. And this would lead us into Full Gear on November 18th, an infamous show for AEW fans, largely on account of the main event, which saw a one-legged MJF go full Monday Night Raw in order to beat Switchblade Jay White. What else was going on here? Well, there were actually some highlights. Highlights such as Adam Copeland teaming up with Sting and Darby Allin to defeat Christian Cage, Luchasaurus, and Nick Wayne. Julia Hart winning the TBS title from Chris Statlander, Timeless Toni Storm arriving in full by taking the Women's World title away from Hikaru Shida, and in probably the promotion's most violent bout to date, Swerve Strickland beating Hangman Page for a second time, and this time in an absolutely incredible Texas death match. Really, given how chaotic things had been for Tony Khan in 2023 then, this would have been a nice way to end the year. But the year wasn't over yet as it happened, because throughout December, we'd get another high watermark. What was this high watermark? Well, after much fan demand, AEW delivered their own version of the G1 Climax in a month-long round-robin tournament known as the Continental Classic. That's right, in the face of the Jacksonville-based promotion increasingly struggling to maintain its identity, the C2 would see them lean fully into the sports-based presentation they'd originally started out with. And what followed on from there would be a critically acclaimed month of television which saw Bryan Danielson, Eddie Kingston, Andrade El Idolo, Claudio Castagnoli, Brody King, Daniel Garcia, Jon Moxley, Swerve Strickland, Jay White, Rush, Mark Briscoe, and Jay Lethal all duke it out to see who would become the inaugural Continental Champion. Who would be in the finals of this tournament once World's End came around on December 30th? Well, that would be warring friends Eddie Kingston and Jon Moxley, with the whole thing ultimately being won by the Mad King as he added a new piece of hardware to his trophy cabinet to become a modern-day Triple Crown champion across AEW, ROH, and New Japan. Of course, this wasn't all that was happening at World's End, though. No, outside of that, Adam Copeland would beat Christian Cage for the TNT title, only for Christian to then immediately cash in a guaranteed rematch in order to win it back again. And once that was done, Timeless Toni Storm would continue to reign supreme during her Women's World title defense, all while a new protege in the form of Mariah May stood in her corner. Then in the main event of the evening, Samoa Joe would upset MJF to win the AEW Men's World title, ending Max's record-breaking reign at 406 days. That said, more so than there being a new champ, the big story here was the fact that, once the bout was over, Adam Cole would return to reveal that he'd been the devil who'd been hounding MJF for months, with this leading to him turning heel on the now former champ and dissolving the Brochachos once and for all. And, like that, a true roller coaster of a year for All Elite Wrestling had come to an end, with the hope going forward being that, with Samoa Joe in possession of the top prize, things would start to get back to its original mission statement once more in 2024. Would this happen? Well, that's a story for another day. By the time the mid-2020s came around, the initial bloom had very much come off the rose for All Elite Wrestling, and that meant, with difficulties continuing to boil up within the company, their mettle was now going to be tested in an even deeper way than ever before. How would they hold up to this pressure? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now in AEW in 2024, a year in review. When we last left off, Women's World Champion Timeless Toni Storm was dealing with a new understudy in the form of Mariah May, Samoa Joe had just won the Men's World title, Hangman Page and Swerve Strickland were engaged in an all-timer of a feud, and after months of mystery, Adam Cole had finally been revealed as the devil who'd been stalking MJF. Unfortunately though, with both Max and Cole now injured, this angle was going to have to be put on ice for a while as the new year began with a bit of a soft reset. What would that soft reset entail? Well, in an attempt to bring back that old sports-centric feel of AEW, as soon as he held the top belt around his waist, Joe would bring back the ranking system, with this meaning that if anyone wanted a shot at his gold going forward, they were going to have to earn it. Of course, it didn't take long for some challengers to present themselves then, the top two of which would be Hangman Page and Swerve Strickland. And they weren't the only ones vying for some gold here as it happened. No, Sting, now in the home stretch of his in-ring career, wanted to go out on top, and that would lead to him and Darby Allin challenging then men's tag team champions Ricky Starks and Big Bill on the February 7th episode of Dynamite and walking out the victors. So like that then, the stage was set for Sting's much-anticipated retirement at Revolution on March 3rd in front of a sold-out Greensboro Coliseum. The only question was, would he and Darby be able to beat their challengers of the Young Bucks that night, allowing the Stinger to retire as an undefeated champion in AEW? Well, before we found out the answer to this, the undercard would first deliver in a big way, when after Christian Cage successfully defended his TNT title against Daniel Garcia, Eddie Kingston beat Bryan Danielson with the Continental Crown on the line, and Roderick Strong ended the second international title run of Orange Cassidy, Timeless Toni Storm would continue to prove why she was such a great performer during her Women's World title defense against Deonna Purrazzo, all while Mariah May watched on lovingly from the sidelines. What happened after that? Well, aside from the now all-elite Will Ospreay tearing the house down with Konosuke Takeshita during his first match as an official member of the roster, Samoa Joe would sneak out of Revolution with the men's world title still around his waist after Hangman Page, in a rather heelish move, tapped out to the Samoan submission machine to ensure Swerve Strickland didn't get the win during their triple threat bout. That said, this was all table setting for the real main event, the men's tag team title showdown between the Young Bucks and Sting and Darby Allin, where in one of the greatest retirements of all time, Steve Borden went out on top after tapping out Matt Jackson with a Scorpion Deathlock. Yes, it was the fairy tale ending everyone had hoped for, and it still stands today as one of AEW's greatest achievements. Sadly though, it also meant Sting was now done as an in-ring performer. So because of that, the tag team titles would be vacated on the following episode of Dynamite, with the new champs to be decided by an upcoming tournament, the finals of which would take place at Dynasty on April 21st. But before that happened, there would be big debuts coming to replace the departing Sting. That's right. Not content with just signing Will Ospreay to a contract, Tony Khan would also bring in Kazuchika Okada on the March 6th episode of Dynamite, with the Rainmaker instantly turning heel here and aligning himself with his real-life buddies, the Young Bucks. And that still wasn't the biggest debut of the month as it happened, because on a special Dynamite episode held on March 13th entitled Big Business, the worst-kept secret in wrestling would be revealed when Mercedes Moné came out to the ring to announce that she, too, was all elite. Clearly then, with all this happening, you would have thought AEW would be on fire in terms of fan interest. But that was not exactly true, as while pay-per-views continued to be stellar, and while the roster was fast turning into one of the greatest ever assembled, weekly TV was still floundering somewhat as creative became more and more haphazard, and both TV ratings and attendance started to drop. How would Tony Khan combat this? Well, one thing he would do to try and get fans excited again was give them some title changes, as it would be on the March 20th episode of Dynamite that not only did Adam Copeland beat Christian Cage in an I Quit match to win the TNT title in front of a hometown Toronto crowd, but Kazuchika Okada would also beat Eddie Kingston in his first match as a full-time member of the roster in order to win the Continental title, and in the process, disband the Continental Crown. But alas, this wasn't enough to turn around the growing fan perception that AEW was in a rut. And this perception would only get worse when, on the April 10th episode of Dynamite, Tony Khan made the decision to air the CCTV footage of the CM Punk Jack Perry Wembley skirmish from the year prior, with that serving as a low point for the promotion overall, as it came across very much like an attempt to hotshot a rating. Still though, even if this was a poor decision, pay-per-view would continue to deliver for fans, especially the one held on April 21st entitled Dynasty. What was so great about this show? Well, aside from the Bang Bang Gang beating the Acclaimed on the pre-show to briefly unify the AEW and ROH Trios titles, Kazuchika Okada would put on a banger of a Continental title defense against PAC. Then, as if that wasn't enough, fan favorite Willow Nightingale would win her first title in Jacksonville when she pinned Julia Hart to walk away with the TBS Championship, all before the Young Bucks won the vacant men's tag team titles. Sure, the Chris Jericho Hook match for the FTW title, which saw the Demo God come out the winner, would be a low point, but things would pick right back up again once this was over, as, in probably the best match AEW has ever put on, and one of the most outstanding matches you're ever going to see in general, Bryan Danielson and Will Ospreay had an absolutely incredible first-time, only-time encounter, which reminded everyone just what the company could be when it was at its best. Who won that one? Well, that would be Will Ospreay. And after this was over, the men's and women's world title would be put on the line. Of course, while Toni Storm would manage to get the better of her challenger for the night here in Thunder Rosa, Samoa Joe would not be so lucky because, after finally getting a one-on-one match with the champ without the now completely deranged Adam Page being there to get involved, Swerve Strickland climbed the mountaintop to become the new AEW Men's World Champion. Yes, there was a fresh sheriff in town down in Jacksonville, and now that he was the guy, Swerve would suddenly find himself with a bullseye painted on his chest, as everyone wanted a piece of him and the gold he held. And that would lead to his first major defense at Double or Nothing on May 26th. Who was the champ facing here? Well, that would be Christian Cage. As you would expect then, Strickland would not drop the belt here. No, by the time all was said and done, and that evening was over, he'd still have it around his waist. Of course, Double or Nothing 2024 was about much more than just Swerve versus Christian. No, as was tradition with AEW, the show was stacked from top to bottom, with some of the more notable undercard bouts seeing Will Ospreay continue his rise by beating Roderick Strong for the international title. the Bang Bang Gang defend their trios title against the Death Triangle, and Toni Storm making relatively short work of her women's world title challenger for the evening, Serena Deeb. Then of course, there was the return to the ring of MJF after 5 months away, a return which saw him quickly take out a still injured Adam Cole in order to tie that angle up for the time being. What else was happening in Paradise, Nevada here? Well, after having headed over to Japan to win the IWGP World title, in the process becoming the only man to ever hold the IWGP, AEW, and WWE titles, Jon Moxley returned stateside to defeat Konosuke Takeshita in an excellent championship eliminator bout. And that still wasn't all that was on show here. No, on top of that, Adam Copeland beat Malachi Black in a steel cage match, in the process breaking his leg. Then, in her first match on the AEW roster, Mercedes Moné would dethrone Willow Nightingale as TBS champion, with this serving as revenge for their first match over in Japan, which Willow had won. As to what could follow that, well, in the main event of the night, Anarchy in the Arena would deliver as advertised for the third year running, as with the final countdown this time playing over the loudspeakers on a loop, the new elite of the Young Bucks, Kazuchika Okada and Jack Perry, beat the Team AEW collective of Bryan Danielson, Darby Allin, and FTR. That's right, even the scapegoat being set on fire with a flamethrower couldn't stop the heels from coming out victorious here. And that only strengthened their resolve to continue on with the hostile takeover they'd by then begun enacting on the company, as it had only been a few weeks prior that, after Perry returned to TV for the first time since the whole CM Punk incident, the new elite laid out Tony Khan and started running roughshod over Dynamite. Where was Kenny Omega in all this? Well, he was going to be out for a while yet, as, after a pretty serious bout of diverticulitis almost turned fatal, he'd be spending the next several months in recovery after getting a large part of his intestines removed. So with the cleaner nowhere to be seen for the foreseeable future then, it was left to the rest of the roster to try and build some momentum back up for AEW. And their next big attempt at doing this would be at Forbidden Door on June 30th, the by now annual New Japan Pro Wrestling crossover show. But it wasn't just New Japan and AEW appearing here anymore. No, this year things would be expanded to also include additional partners such as CMLL and Stardom. What matches would this situation create? Well, aside from MJF going one-on-one with Hechicero and Bryan Danielson getting the better of Shingo Takagi, Mariah May would find herself in the middle of a love triangle when her mentor Toni Storm took on her old tag team partner from Japan, Mina Shirakawa. Then, after Zack Sabre Jr. had a banger against Orange Cassidy, Jack Perry would win a ladder match for the TNT title Adam Copeland had vacated after breaking his leg the month prior. But that still wasn't all, as once these bouts were done, Mercedes Moné, now beginning her belt collector gimmick, would defend her TBS and New Japan Strong Women's titles against Stephanie Vaquer, all before Swerve Strickland solidified himself as a permanent main eventer by handing Will Ospreay his first loss in AEW during the men's world title match. Where was Jon Moxley and his IWGP Heavyweight title in all of this? Well, the BCC member would be dropping that to Tetsuya Naito in the semi-main event, and upon doing this, he'd take a leave of absence as rumors of burnout on his part started to swirl around. So that meant he wouldn't be around for the build to AEW's return to Wembley Stadium in August, a build which really got going when, after Blood and Guts saw Team AEW beat the New Elite to abruptly end the hostile takeover angle, the men's and women's brackets of the 2024 Owen Hart Cup were won by Bryan Danielson and Mariah May, respectively, with Mariah shocking everyone here when she turned on her mentor Toni Storm immediately after coming out on top in the finals. Why had she done this? Well, with the prize for the tournament this year being a world title shot at All In, the Londoner now had everything she needed from the Timeless One. Yes, as it turned out, she'd been stringing her beloved along all this time, just waiting for the right moment to strike. And that right moment, as it happened, would come in front of 55,000 fans in England on August 25th, as in a show which this time had the card to match the atmosphere. All In truly felt like AEW's equivalent of WrestleMania for the first time. Obviously then, when Mariah May beat Toni Storm early on in the evening here, it signaled that she was fully ready to take over the division. And she wouldn't be the only new champion that night. No, in what would turn out to be one of AEW's best pay-per-view offerings ever, the Blackpool Combat Club trio of Claudio Castagnoli, Wheeler Yuta, and new recruit Pac would win the trios titles. Hook would regain the FTW title from Chris Jericho, and Will Ospreay would win back possession of the international title MJF had beaten him for in a near hour-long bout at Dynamite 250 about a month prior. What was happening outside of these big wins? Well, while Mercedes Moné's TBS title defense against Britt Baker would disappoint so badly it contributed toward Baker being pulled from TV afterwards as rumors of attitude problems on her part grew stronger, Sting would bring things back up again by making a return to help Darby Allin fend off the threat of the Elite. And on top of that, a very fun new match type would come to pay-per-view in the form of the Casino Gauntlet, something which has been described as a work-rate Royal Rumble and which would even see Nigel McGuinness return to the ring. Then, in the main event, Bryan Danielson would defeat Swerve Strickland for the men's world title in a moment which the American Dragon has gone on to describe as his favorite of his entire career. Of course, Bryan was somewhat helped in winning here by Hangman Page, someone who was still obsessed with destroying the life of Swerve at all costs, to the point that he'd now completely lost himself in his hatred. And that hatred would be on full display when on the following episode of Dynamite, the Cowboy torched the childhood home of his rival to the ground. Obviously then, this beef was going to have to be settled once and for all, and that climax would happen at All Out on September 7th, as it was here, after the undercard saw such highlights as Will Ospreay vs. Pac for the International Championship, Bryan Danielson defending his men's world title against Jack Perry, and a fantastic Chicago street fight pitting best friends turned enemies Willow Nightingale and Chris Statlander against one another in the lights out steel cage main event. Perhaps the most violent bout you're ever likely to see took place. One which involved hypodermic needles, shoot cinder blocks, and an absolutely brutal-looking worked chair shot to the skull from the Hangman to Swerve to close things out with a bang. Yes, and a mirror of AEW losing its way as a company, Adam Page had now also fully embraced his dark side, and in the process of doing so, he'd discovered that finally getting his revenge on his rival had not made him feel whole again. No, he was still angry at the world. And without him serving as the babyface main character to keep things on track, it was going to be left to someone else to step into his spot. Enter Jon Moxley. You see, part of the reason Mox had taken a leave of absence prior to All In was because he had allegedly grown legitimately frustrated with the direction the company was moving in. So in an attempt to get things moving again, he'd devised a plan during his time away, a plan which, now that he was back, he hoped, both on screen and behind the scenes, would motivate the promotion as a whole to turn things around once more. What did this plan involve? Well, the first step would be to destroy the Blackpool Combat Club when he and the rest of the stable suffocated Bryan Danielson with a plastic bag following his world title defense against Jack Perry at All Out. And after he did that, Mox would create a new stable out of the ashes of the BCC, one named the Death Riders, which, aside from Claudio Castagnoli, Pac, and Wheeler Yuta, would also include a female member in Marina Shafir. But that was only the beginning of the Ace's plans, because from here he'd head into Grand Slam on September 25th, a show once more being held from Arthur Ashe Stadium in New York, and after the undercard saw Bryan Danielson have a nostalgia-filled bout with his old rival Nigel McGuinness, and Hook formally retire the FTW title after beating Roderick Strong, Moxley would get the better of the incoming #1 contender to the Men's World Championship Darby Allin in order to book his shot at the American Dragon at WrestleDream on October 12th. Would the challenger be able to dethrone his former stablemate here and enact the next stage of his plan to kickstart AEW? Well, that would become clear by the end of the night. Prior to this, however, the undercard would see such highlights as Switchblade Jay White beating Hangman Page, Konosuke Takeshita winning the international title from Will Ospreay and AEW newcomer Ricochet in a fantastic three-way bout, and now, with Toni Storm missing in action, Mariah May be able to get the better of her women's world title challenger for the evening, Willow Nightingale. Of course, none of this was the real selling point of the show, however. No, the real selling point was whether or not, with his full-time in-ring career on the line, Bryan Danielson would be able to walk into his home state of Washington and retain the men's world title against the ever-growing threat of Jon Moxley and the Death Riders. And sadly, the answer to that question was no, he would not. Rather, by the time all was said and done, Danielson would be written off indefinitely after getting pinned and plastic bagged once again. And now that Mox had the men's world title in his possession, he'd hide it away in a briefcase, with his logic being that, in kayfabe, until someone stepped up to beat him, and in reality until AEW could get itself back on track again, no one would get to see the physical title. No, for the rest of 2024, the belt would be hidden from view. And that would mean when Moxley defended against Orange Cassidy at Full Gear on November 23rd, it would still be hidden in that briefcase being carried around by Marina Shafir. Unsurprisingly then, the one true king of these lands would win this match, And in the process, he'd piss off a lot of fans, as now playing an old territory-style heel, one who wanted fans to legitimately hate him. He'd remove all the fun things about his character, including the sing-along theme song and the bloody brawls. Sure, there was a logic to this, as Mox hoped that, in being the most hated man in the company, he'd be able to serve as a lightning rod for all of fans' frustrations within AEW, all while the rest of the show was quietly being built back up around him. But that didn't make it any more enjoyable to watch his work over the months which followed, as Death Rider's segments quickly turned into a chore to get through. Hell, even if the rest of the Full Gear card was largely good, what with it seeing the Hurt Syndicate make an early mark in Jacksonville when Bobby Lashley beat Swerve Strickland, Mercedes Moné finally hit her stride in AEW during her TBS title defense against Chris Statlander, new men's tag team champions Private Party rack up a victory, and Daniel Garcia win the TNT title from Jack Perry, it all felt like it was being brought down by that main event scene, which was centered around the Death Riders. Really, if it weren't for the return of the Continental Classic in December, weekly TV would have been a lot harder to get through. Just as well, this was here then as, with the lineup this time including Kyle Fletcher, Mark Briscoe, Daniel Garcia, Shelton Benjamin, The Beast Mortos, Will Ospreay, Claudio Castagnoli, Darby Allin, Brody King, a newly heel Ricochet, a last-minute substitute for an injured Juice Robinson in the form of Commander, and incoming Continental Champion Konosuke Takeshita, the C2 once again delivered on the promise of it being an American G1 climax. Who would win the tournament this year? Well, we'd find that out at the final pay-per-view of 2024, World's End, on December 28th. Yes, it was here that after the semifinals earlier on in the evening saw Will Ospreay beat his former friend Kyle Fletcher and Kazuchika Okada defeat Ricochet, the Rainmaker would go on to the final a couple of hours later and there successfully retain his Continental title after beating his former New Japan protege in another great bout. And that was far from the only thing worth watching at World's End as it happened, because aside from this, there would be plenty of other highlights. What were some of these highlights? Well, after a returning Toni Storm appeared on the pre-show following an apparent mental collapse which caused her to revert back to her rookie days, MJF and Adam Cole would finally have their singles match, albeit one which made little sense at this point, as the former was now a heel and the latter was now a babyface. Elsewhere, meanwhile, Mercedes Moné would have another banger TBS title defense against Chris Statlander, Mariah May would retain her women's world title in a Tijuana street fight against Thunder Rosa, and Konosuke Takeshita would walk in and out as international champion after a hard-fought battle with Powerhouse Hobbs. Then, in the main event of the evening, Hangman Page, Orange Cassidy, and Switchblade Jay White would all stake their claims at the AEW Men's World title during a four-way bout against Jon Moxley, with Moxley winning again here. That's right, with no one stepping up to beat them yet, and with AEW still struggling to rediscover its identity, the Death Riders remained on top. Hell, even Christian Cage threatening to cash in the guaranteed world title shot he'd held ever since winning the Casino Gauntlet at All In couldn't do much to scare Jon Moxley. No, to him, the idea of a Money in the Bank style cash-in was exactly the kind of WWE style he wanted AEW to move away from, as he believed it was part of the reason the whole operation had lost its way. Would he ultimately succeed in moving things back in a better direction and, in the process, kickstarting the promotion again, as was his plan? And would that plan lead to Darby Allin eventually dethroning him once he returned from his hiatus to go climb Mount Everest, as was clearly the play at this point in time? That would remain to be seen. One thing was for sure though, 2025 was looking set to be a critical year for All Elite Wrestling, and the reason for this was because, while 2024 had seen some incredible highs in the form of the Sting retirement, All In, the C2, and the continued saga of Toni Storm and Mariah May, and the savage climax to this chapter of the Hangman Page Swerve Strickland feud, it had also seen some pretty low lows, such as the New Elite hostile takeover, the airing of the CM Punk Wembley footage, and the general feeling of weak booking being persistent on weekly TV, with all of this leaving many longtime fans at their breaking point as they prayed that before things reached the point of no return, a turnaround would finally come. 2024 had been a tough year for All Elite Wrestling because, while they'd certainly had some standout moments, overall, the perception of the promotion had never been lower. So because of that, there was a sense that some changes desperately needed to be made. Would this happen, and would Tony Khan and company be able to turn the momentum back in their favor? Well, that's exactly what we are going to be looking at right now in AEW in 2025, a year in review. When we last left off, Toni Storm had suffered an apparent mental break which saw her return to her rookie gimmick, and not only had Hangman Page fully lost himself in his dark side, but Jon Moxley and the Death Riders were holding the men's world title hostage inside of a briefcase until a babyface could step up to beat the champ. Would that babyface appear as January got going? No, it wouldn't, because as Dynamite and Collision both now began being simulcast every week on HBO Max, the next challenger to Mox, Powerhouse Hobbs, would fail to get the better of him at Maximum Carnage on January 15th. That said, it would be at this same show that we did see hope beginning to form, because it was here that after beating one of his mentors, Christopher Daniels, in a Texas death match, Adam Page started to realize that the path he'd been heading down was doing him no good, and that he needed to find the light once more. But this wouldn't be something which took place overnight for the cowboy. No, he'd still have a road to go down yet before he got there. What else was happening in AEW throughout the early part of the year? Well, aside from the Hurt Syndicate beating Private Party to win the men's tag team titles on January 22nd, the New Japan co-promoted show Wrestle Dynasty took place at the Tokyo Dome on January 5th and featured not only Mercedes Moné adding the undisputed British Women's Championship to her ever-growing belt collection, but also an all-time classic between Gabe Kidd and a returning Kenny Omega. And once that show was over, Tony Khan and company would make their debut in Australia. Yes, it was on February 15th that Grand Slam Australia took place live from Brisbane, with a card that included the Cleaner teaming up with Will Ospreay to take on a common enemy in the Don Callis family, Harley Cameron arriving in full during her TBS title challenge against the CEO, and Toni Storm, now having revealed herself to have been timeless all along, defeat Mariah May to regain her Women's World Championship. Obviously then, this was a very well-received show. And it signaled the start of a change in the air because with the build-up to this and the following major event, Revolution, being pretty strong, there was a sense that AEW was gaining momentum again. How had this happened? Well, partly inspired by Jon Moxley's willingness to cast himself as the shoot villain in order to get the company moving again, and partly in response to complaints that older stars like Jeff Jarrett were starting to take up too much TV time, Tony Khan had reportedly gotten back in the weeds of creative as he stopped relying so much on a larger writing team, much in the same way as he had in early 2020. So because of that, all of a sudden, weekly TV started feeling much more cohesive as some of that old spark returned to Dynamite. And when Revolution came around on March 9th, there was a lot of positivity amongst the fan base as a result. Thankfully then, this positivity was largely rewarded as the show which was put on here was another typically great pay-per-view offering from All Elite Wrestling. What were some of the highlights? Well, aside from Hangman Page moving ever closer to a full babyface turn by beating MJF, the women's division in Jacksonville would show how much it had improved with the 1-2 punch of Mercedes Moné successfully defending her TBS title against Stardom's Momo Watanabe, and Toni Storm rising to another level of popularity again by ending Mariah May's run in AEW during the spectacular Hollywood ending. Yes, with this win, the Timeless One had reached a level where she was arguably now the biggest star in the entire promotion. That said, her match would not be the main event on this evening. Rather, there would be a few bouts which came after, the first of which saw Kenny Omega beat Konosuke Takeshita for the international title, and Will Ospreay reign victorious over his former friend Kyle Fletcher in a stellar steel cage match. Unfortunately though, while both of these two bouts more than delivered, the same could not be said for the men's world title match, the one pitting Jon Moxley against Adam Copeland. No, that one would pretty much stink out the joint, as Mox continued to draw heat by purposefully stripping his act of all the fun parts. That said, at least it would rid the promotion of the Money in the Bank style guaranteed title shot Christian Cage had, as it was here he would unsuccessfully cash in. And while it wasn't entertaining to watch, it was serving the continued purpose of turning the Death Riders into a lightning rod for all of fans' frustrations, allowing the rest of the company to build itself back up around it. Would this still be the dynamic on display at Dynasty on April 6th? Yes, it would, because it's there, while the undercard once again delivered with bouts like Bandito winning the ROH World title from a soon-to-be disappearing Chris Jericho, Adam Cole getting the better of Daniel Garcia to gain possession of the TNT title, and Kenny Omega, Ricochet, and AEW newcomer Speedball Mike Bailey tearing the house down during the international title bout. Jon Moxley would once more leave fans going home disappointed as his pretty weak men's world title defense against Swerve Strickland saw him come out on top again. That's right, by now the general feeling was that whilst almost everything about the Jacksonville promotion was starting to click again, the Death Riders continued to be an anchor weighing the whole operation down, something Mox hoped was going to lead to a big payoff later in the year. Before we get there though, one of the best episodes of Dynamite to date, Spring Breakthrough, would take place on April 16th and would see not only Mercedes Moné and Athena have a dream match, but also the Ops finally strike a blow to the Death Riders by ending their run as Trios champions. What a great way this was then for AEW to celebrate the fact that, with this episode of TV, Dynamite had officially surpassed Nitro in terms of how long it had been on the air. And the role Tony Khan was on now would only continue as the weeks progressed, because after Jon Moxley successfully defended his men's world title, one which remained hidden away inside that briefcase against Samoa Joe inside of a steel cage at Beach Break on May 14th, Double or Nothing would come around on May 25th and would give wrestling fans a strong contender for Best Show of 2025. Why was that? Well, this was the point all the momentum AEW had been building felt like it finally reached a stage where the larger wrestling fandom began taking notice, as on this show, not only would the undercard shine with a Kazuchika Okada Speedball Mike Bailey banger for the Continental title, another successful men's tag team title defense for the Hurt Syndicate, and a very fun women's world title defense pitting Toni Storm against her former rival in love and now in-screen wife, Mina Shirakawa, but the finals of the women's bracket of the 2025 Owen Hart Cup would see Mercedes Moné defeat Jamie Hayter to book her shot at the top prize at All In a couple of months later, something she hoped was going to end with her adding yet another belt to her by now extensive collection. What else was happening at Double or Nothing to make it such a highlight of the year? Well, in the semi-main event of the evening, Anarchy in the Arena would return for perhaps its best incarnation yet, as now, with Drowning Pool's Bodies serving as the soundtrack to the mayhem on display, the babyface alliance of Kenny Omega, Swerve Strickland, Samoa Joe, Powerhouse Hobbs, Katsuyori Shibata, and Willow Nightingale struck another blow to the Death Riders elite collective of Jon Moxley, Claudio Castagnoli, Wheeler Yuta, Marina Shafir, and the Young Bucks. Then in the main event, the finals of the men's bracket of the Owen Hart Cup saw Hangman Page go one-on-one with Will Ospreay, with the winner being the one who would serve as AEW's last big shot at getting the belt off Mox at Globe Life Field in Texas. Yes, after it had become clear the original choice to end the tyranny of the Death Riders, Darby Allin, was not going to be back from climbing Mount Everest in time, Tony Khan was forced to pivot with his all-in plans. Luckily for him then, he had a perfect replacement staring him right in the face, because now it was becoming clear that the story of Adam Page's return to the light and the downfall of Jon Moxley were actually the same story. So because of that, when the redemption angle of the Hangman met the ascension hopes of Ospreay in the main event of Double or Nothing, it would be the Cowboy who came out on top in a true Match of the Year contender. That's right, now having fully remembered who he was, Adam Page was ready to save AEW by getting the world title out of that briefcase. Before he could do this though, the promotion would make a stop in yet another new territory, because it would be on June 18th that the Jacksonville-based company headed down to the iconic Arena Mexico, one of the four crucibles of wrestling alongside Madison Square Garden, Wembley Stadium, and the Tokyo Dome, for Grand Slam Mexico. What happened here? Well, after the Hangman came across like the world's biggest babyface when he cut a promo in Spanish to the live crowd, professing his love for the Mexican people and everything they offered to his own country, another fantastic episode of Dynamite would take place in which Mercedes Moné won the CMLL Women's World title from Zeusis, and the Death Riders, the Young Bucks, and the Beast Mortos came together to defeat the Ops, Swerve Strickland, and Will Ospreay. Of course, perhaps the highlight of the whole show though, outside of that Adam Page promo, was the incredible Mystico appearance to take on MJF, particularly his entrance, which left the sold-out crowd of 14,000 people singing along with every word to his theme. So good did this leave the vibes, in fact, afterward it felt like all AEW had to do now was stick the landing with All In. So when that show finally arrived on July 12th, there was a sense that this was one of the most important days in the company's history, as a setback here could undo a lot of the goodwill they'd built up during the months prior. Thankfully then, things would get off to a strong start when the Ops were able to defeat the Death Riders to retain their Trios championships. That said, after doing so, they'd be taken out by the heel faction, meaning they wouldn't be there to help out Hangman Page during the main event. You see, in the lead up to All In, it had become clear that if the Cowboy wanted to get the belt off of Mox, he was going to need help, and that was why a babyface alliance led by Will Ospreay had tried to rally the troops around the #1 contender. One person whose status within this group remained unclear, however, was Swerve Strickland, as with the wounds between him and Page still being deep, there was a sense that they might not ever be able to see eye to eye again. Obviously then, with the Ops now being out of the equation, this didn't leave the challenger with a lot of backup left. And that must have been playing on his mind while the rest of the undercard took place. An undercard which featured Dustin Rhodes winning the TNT title after a tearful Adam Cole had been forced to vacate mere moments prior, and Swerve and Ospreay beating the Young Bucks and in the process stripping them of their EVP powers. Then once that was over, MJF and Athena would win the men's and women's casino gauntlets respectively, with these victories granting each a future world title shot, though one which would crucially now have to be announced at least a week ahead of time so that Tony Khan could promote the bout. What came after this? Well, in the first of 3 main events, Mercedes Moné ate her first loss in AEW during an absolute banger of a women's world title challenge against Toni Storm. And in the second-to-last contest of the evening, International Champion Kenny Omega and Continental Champion Kazuchika Okada would reignite their classic rivalry from New Japan Pro Wrestling, with Okada picking up the victory here in order to briefly unify both prizes, something which was signified when he was awarded the ceremonial unified title after the fact. That said, for as great as all this was, it was really the closer fans were there to see. And a full 4 hours into the show, the energy for this would remain sky high, as initially coming out to a live performance of the theme song to a fistful of dollars, and then to his old babyface entrance theme, Hangman Page arrived in the Lone Star State for his Texas death match with Jon Moxley. Really, the only question here was, could he do it? And we'd soon find out the answer to that, as over the course of 35 minutes which followed, a blood-soaked encounter saw shoot forkings, bed of nails, and appearances from Will Ospreay, Bryan Danielson, and a returning Darby Allin to neutralize the other Death Riders, give the Cowboy a fighting chance. In the end though, even this might not have been enough if it hadn't been for Swerve Strickland coming out toward the end of the bout to finally bury his beef with the Hangman by handing him a steel chain to be used as a weapon. Thankfully then he did do this, and as the one true king of these lands finally tapped while being choked out with this chain, all while a colossal roar of relief emanated from the audience, he was able to lay there at ringside, safe in the knowledge that his plan to kickstart AEW had worked. Yes, what poetry it was then that this happened as the main character of the promotion fully rediscovered himself too. Honestly, at this point, everyone was just eager to see where things would go from here, as the vibes had not felt this high for Tony Khan and co. since prior to the events of Brawl Out. That said, while things were certainly on a roll again now, it wasn't like AEW would be without setbacks heading into the autumn. No, pretty soon both Swerve Strickland and Will Ospreay would be out indefinitely as a result of injury, leaving the company without 2 of its modern-day 4 pillars. Before that happened, however, things would move back over to the UK, as after a stopover in Glasgow, Scotland for an episode of Dynamite, Forbidden Door set an all-time attendance record for the O2 Arena in London on August 24th, with the fans who paid to see this show being treated to another crossover with New Japan, Stardom, and CMLL. What specifically was on the card here? Well, aside from Kyle Fletcher defending his newly won TNT title against Hiromu Takahashi, Zack Sabre Jr. defending his IWGP World Heavyweight title against Nigel McGuinness, and Brodito winning the AEW Men's Tag Team titles, Athena would unsuccessfully use her guaranteed Women's World title shot against Toni Storm, MJF would lose to Hangman Page, though would be able to do so without cashing in his contract, and in the main event, a lights-out steel cage match would see Hiroshi Tanahashi's last appearance in the UK as he teamed up with Will Ospreay, Darby Allin, Kenny Omega, and Kota Ibushi to defeat the Death Riders and the Young Bucks. Sure, this one would end with Ospreay being taken out by the Death Riders and written off of television as he went to get neck surgery, but it wasn't like that was enough to bring fan satisfaction down. No, this would remain high heading into All Out on September 20th, as it was there that not only would Adam Copeland and Christian Cage team up again to defeat FTR, but fresh off a lengthy spell out with injury, Eddie Kingston would return to get the better of Big Bill. Then, after a very fun tables and tacks match between MJF and Mark Briscoe ended with the former taking a brief sabbatical in order to enjoy his honeymoon, Kazuchika Okada, Konosuke Takeshita, and CMLL's Mascara Dorada would steal the show into the unified title bout. But still, this wasn't everything All Out had to offer. No, once those bouts were over, not only would Chris Statlander shock the wrestling world by winning the Women's World title during a 4-way which also included Jamie Hayter, newcomer Tekla, and incoming champ Toni Storm, also, Hangman Page would elevate Kyle Fletcher to the level of main eventer during an excellent Men's World title showdown. As you would expect then, the Cowboy won this one, and that meant he'd still be the champ as Wrestle Dream came around on October 18th. Who would he be defending against there? Well, that would be Samoa Joe. And while the champ would retain again, in doing so, he'd upset Joe so much that the Samoan Submission Machine and the rest of the ops would turn heel on him after laying him out post-match. What else was happening at Wrestle Dream aside from this? Well, apart from a newly reformed Jurassic Express defeating the Young Bucks, a duo whose gimmick was now that they were completely broke as the result of them no longer being EVPs in kayfabe, Kris Statlander would solidify herself as the true Women's World Champion by beating Toni Storm one-on-one. And once that was over, fresh off of destroying Ultimo Dragon's record of holding 10 belts simultaneously, Mercedes Moné added a 13th piece of hardware to her collection when she beat Mina Shirakawa for the interim ROH Women's World Television Championship. Then, after Brodito defended their men's tag team titles in a banger against the slowly fracturing Don Callis family partnership of Kazuchika Okada and Konosuke Takeshita, Jon Moxley and Darby Allin finally blew things off with a typically savage I Quit match, which saw Darby come out the victor after an appearance from Sting to fend off the Death Riders allowed the babyface to tap out Mox with a Scorpion Deathlock. That's right, after being so dominant for so long, Moxley had now tapped out twice in big money bouts over the space of a few short months. Unsurprisingly then, this did a number on his confidence. So when he faced off against Kyle O'Reilly at Friday Night Dynamite on October 29th, rather than tap out again after getting caught in an ankle lock, he'd attack the referee to get himself DQ'd. Unfortunately for the Ace, however, disqualifications would not be an option inside Blood and Guts. So when that show came around again on November 12th, and this time saw the Death Riders face off against Darby Allin and the Conglomeration, Mox would have no choice but to submit for a third time when Kyle caught him again. Of course, it wasn't just a men's Blood and Guts match which was happening this year. No, for the first time ever, a women's version would be added to the lineup too, with this one seeing the heel collective of the Triangle of Madness, the Mega Problems, and Mercedes Moné get the better of the babyface sextet of Toni Storm, Mina Shirakawa, Willow Nightingale, Harley Cameron, Jamie Hayter, and Kris Statlander. Yes, the women's division in AEW was really cooking now, and that would remain the case at Full Gear on November 22nd, because after FTR won the men's tag team titles from Brodito, and after Ricochet became the inaugural national champion, Kris Statlander would further Mercedes Moné's downfall by handing her her second loss in AEW during the Women's World title bout. Elsewhere, meanwhile, after Jon Moxley submitted to Kyle O'Reilly yet again, Mark Briscoe would win the TNT title from Kyle Fletcher. And once that was over, after the Young Bucks turned babyface in order to back up Kenny Omega during his ongoing battle with the now small country-sized Don Callis family, Samoa Joe pulled off a huge upset when he beat Hangman Page for the men's world title in the Steel Cage main event. Yes, Joe was now the two-time champ, and that meant, right in the midst of the third annual Continental Classic, a tournament which this time included Jon Moxley, Konosuke Takeshita, Claudio Castagnoli, Orange Cassidy, Mascara Dorada, Roderick Strong, Kyle Fletcher, Kevin Knight, Speedball Mike Bailey, Pac, a last-minute sub for an injured Darby Allin in the form of Jack Perry, and incoming Continental champ Kazuchika Okada, the men's world champion would be defending his gold against Eddie Kingston at Winter is Coming on December 10th. Was anything else notable happening at Winter is Coming? Why yes, as it would be there that in the finals of a tournament which had been taking place over the weeks prior, the Babes of Wrath duo of Willow Nightingale and Harley Cameron defeated the Timeless Love Bombs pairing of Toni Storm and Mina Shirakawa to become the inaugural AEW Women's Tag Team Champions. And now that Willow and Harley had the gold, they'd head into World's End on December 27th ready to successfully defend against Mercedes Moné and Athena. Elsewhere on the last pay-per-view of the year, meanwhile, after Kris Statlander retained her women's world title against Jamie Hayter, the C2 semifinals would see the tensions between Kazuchika Okada and Konosuke Takeshita finally bubble over on one side of the bracket, with the Rainmaker winning here, all while on the other side of the bracket, Jon Moxley was able to squeak out a win over Kyle Fletcher. And that led right into the finals a couple of hours later, where in a remarkable character turnaround, Jon Moxley's sympathetic plight to regain his confidence had gotten fans back on his side again. Obviously then, when he went on to beat Okada to take the Continental title away from him, in the process ending the short run of the ceremonial Unified title, the Ace received a huge babyface reaction. One person who would not receive such a reaction, however, would be MJF, because after returning a couple of weeks prior to announce he was cashing in his guaranteed men's world title shot at World's End, he'd get the better of Hangman Page, Swerve Strickland, and incoming champ Samoa Joe to become the two-time top dog down in Jacksonville. That's right, before he'd even turned 30, Maxwell Jacob Friedman was a two-time world champion. Needless to say then, this closed out World's End with a bang. But it wouldn't be the end of the year for AEW quite yet, as it happened, because at New Year's Smash on December 31st, one final feel-good moment would be offered up to fans when, fresh after losing her CMLL Women's World title, her undisputed British Women's title, and her ROH Women's World Television title, Mercedes Moné finally dropped the TBS title to Willow Nightingale, the same woman she'd initially beaten for it 584 days prior. Yes, Willow was now a double champ, something which highlighted just how much better the vibes felt in AEW as 2025 drew to a close. Could the company keep up this newly rediscovered momentum heading into 2026, however? And would that all lead to Will Ospreay returning from injury in time to win the men's world title at Wembley in 2026? That's a story for another day. For now, though, it was clear that over the course of this 12-month period, the ghosts of the post-Brawl Out period had finally been exorcised for All Elite Wrestling. And with them now figuring out who they were again, they were ready to once more thrive as the decade reached its second half.